I am 61 years old, and I have spent the vast majority of my adult life prosecuting people for federal crimes. When you spend 3 decades as a federal prosecutor in the United States Department of Justice, you learn a few unavoidable truths about human nature. You learn that evil rarely looks like a monster. It doesn't skulk in the shadows or announce itself with menacing music. Real danger arrives dressed in a sharply tailored suit, offering a firm handshake, maintaining perfect eye contact, and presenting a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything. It arrives looking exactly like the thing you most want to believe in. My name is Thomas Vance. I live on the Shenandoah Ridge Estate, a sprawling 450-acre property in Virginia, about an hour and a half outside of Washington, D.C. The estate runs from a winding river on the western edge up toward a dense timberline of ancient oak and pine. The rolling hills of the pasture land in between are dotted with Black Angus cattle. In the early mornings, when the thick mountain mist settles low over the grazing fields and the cattle move slowly through the dew-soaked grass, it looks like a scene pulled from an oil painting. My late wife, Catherine, always used to say it was God's way of showing off. Catherine was my wife for 32 years. She was the anchor of my life, the quiet strength that kept me grounded when the federal courts threatened to harden my heart permanently. We lost her in the spring of 2022, exactly 14 months after she was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. By the time the doctors found it, it was already stage 3. I still remember the day we got the news. The oncologist at Johns Hopkins sat across from us in a sterile, impeccably clean office. There was a fresh box of tissues sitting precisely on the corner of his desk. I remember staring at that box with the cold, detached clarity of a man who had spent his entire career absorbing horrific details without flinching. I knew those tissues were a permanent fixture. I knew he placed them there every morning, exactly the way other professionals arrange their pens or coffee mugs. "How long?" I asked him. The doctor looked at me, then at Catherine, and then back at me. With aggressive treatment, possibly 18 months. Without it, 6 to 9. Catherine reached over and covered my hand with hers. Her skin was warm, her grip steady. "Thomas," she said quietly, her voice laced with that gentle authority she always possessed. "Stop cross-examining the man. He's just doing his job, even here, even now." She actually made me smile in that terrible office. We chose the treatment. We fought that cancer for 14 months with every weapon modern medicine could provide, bolstered by Catherine's sheer, unyielding stubbornness. She was a high school history teacher, and she taught her last class in October of 2021, standing at the front of her classroom with chalk dust on her sleeve, refusing to take a leave of absence until the semester was completely finished. She didn't want her students' pity. She wanted their absolute attention. That was just who she was. The final weeks were spent at the hospital in Baltimore. I drove up every single morning before dawn and stayed by her side until the nursing staff practically forced me to go home. Our daughter, Sarah, flew in from Boston every weekend. Sarah is a pediatric surgeon. She spends her life fixing tiny broken hearts, and watching her sit utterly helpless beside her mother's bed was, without a doubt, the most agonizing thing I have ever had to witness. On the 4th day of Catherine's final week, she had a brief window of clarity. She was awake for nearly an hour, her mind sharper than it had been in days. She looked at me with those piercing blue eyes that had kept me honest for 3 decades, and she asked me to promise her 2 things. "The first one is easy," she said, her voice thin and raspy, but her tone uncompromising. "Stop working 80 hours a week, Thomas. Retire, stay at the estate, take care of the cattle. Live like a human being, not a machine for the Justice Department." "I promise," I said, my throat feeling like it was packed with dry sand. "Good." She squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a moment. "The second one is harder to explain. I need you to trust, but verify. Always verify." She paused, her eyes narrowing slightly, a look she got when she was calculating something important. "Especially with Sarah." I frowned, leaning closer. "Catherine, what do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said," she replied, her gaze boring into mine. "You spent 30 years reading people, dismantling liars in a courtroom. Don't stop reading them just because they're sitting at your dinner table. Promise me, Thomas." At the time, I thought she was referring to Sarah's demanding career, the brutal politics of hospital administration, or the kind of heavy, life-altering professional decisions a father might need to help his daughter navigate. It made perfect sense to me in the way that things make sense when you are desperately trying to comfort a dying woman. "I promise," I told her. She closed her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips. "Good man," she whispered. 3 days later, she was gone. In the long, hollow months that followed her death, I kept the first promise. I submitted my retirement papers, handed off my remaining federal cases, and retreated full-time to the Shenandoah Ridge estate. I threw myself into learning the intricacies of the cattle operation from our estate manager, a weathered, 60-year-old local named Henry Cobb, who had zero patience for a former federal prosecutor who didn't know the difference between winter forage and spring grazing. For a long time, I didn't fully understand Catherine's second promise: trust, but verify, especially with Sarah. I turned those words over in my mind during the endless, quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sun dip below the timberline. I examined her warning from every possible angle a prosecutor could conceive, but I never found a satisfying answer. Not until the night Sarah called me from Boston, her voice carrying a sound I hadn't heard in years. "Hope, February in Virginia is a month of waiting. The cattle are huddled and settled. The winter chill bites deep into the bones, and the estate exists in a kind of frozen stillness, waiting for the ground to thaw and the first shoots of green to break through the frost." I was sitting at the heavy oak table in the kitchen that Tuesday evening, nursing a cup of black coffee and reviewing a stack of property tax assessments when my phone vibrated against the wood. The screen flashed Sarah's name. She rarely called on a weeknight unless there was an emergency at the hospital or something was terribly wrong. My chest tightened automatically, a residual reflex from the trauma of losing Catherine. Even 2 years later, I hadn't fully trained myself out of that half-second of pure dread before answering the phone. I picked it up on the second ring. "Hey, sweetie, is everything okay?" There was a brief pause. "Yes," she said, and then she let out a breath. "Actually, yes. More than okay, Dad." I set my pen down. Something in the cadence of her voice made me sit up straighter. It was significantly lighter than I had heard it in a very long time. It wasn't the careful, measured, controlled lightness she used when she was managing the immense stress of pediatric surgery. This was something entirely genuine, unguarded, and vulnerable. It reminded me of how she used to sound on Christmas mornings when she was 10 years old. "Tell me," I said gently. "I met someone." The words tumbled out of her in a sudden rush, as if she had been holding them behind a dam and finally let the water break. "Last Saturday at the Children's Hospital Charity Gala. His name is Julian Thorne. He's 44. He works as a wealth management specialist out of New York. And Dad, he actually listened to me. Like genuinely listened. He wasn't just waiting for his turn to speak or glancing at his phone. He just listened." My heart did a complicated, painful little flip. On one hand, I felt a sharp, profound joy for her. Sarah had spent the last 4 years pouring every ounce of her soul into her surgical career, burying herself in work after a particularly painful end to a relationship she refused to talk about. But beneath that joy, something smaller, quieter, and much colder stirred. It was the reflex I had honed over 30 years of prosecuting fraud and corruption. It was the instinct that fires a warning shot across the brain when someone describes a scenario that sounds just a little too perfect. I firmly pressed the instinct down. "Where did you two end up talking?" I asked, keeping my tone entirely casual. "By the grand windows overlooking the harbor. We were both bidding at the silent auction." He made some witty comment about the champagne being vastly overpriced for a charity event, and I told him that overpaying was the entire point of a charity event. Somehow, that brief exchange turned into a 2-hour conversation. She laughed, a real warm laugh that seemed to surprise even her. "He asked me about my surgeries, Dad. Not the polite, generic version. He asked highly specific follow-up questions. He wanted to understand the actual mechanics of what a pediatric surgeon does on a random Tuesday afternoon." "That's a good sign," I said, and part of me genuinely meant it. We exchanged numbers. He texted me the very next morning. Another pause, softer this time, filled with a fragile kind of hope. I wanted you to know." I smiled into the empty kitchen. "I'm so glad you told me, Sarah." And I was, But even as the words left my mouth, Catherine's voice echoed in the back of my mind, quiet, steady, and resolute. Trust but verify, especially with Sarah. I instinctively reached for my pen again. Tell me a little more about him. Where is he from originally? The West Coast, somewhere. He mentioned growing up near the ocean, but he moved to New York about 15 years ago to establish his practice. The West Coast, somewhere that was not a specific answer. It was a deflection. I noted it mentally without altering my tone. Which firm does he manage wealth for? He's independent. He works directly with high-net-worth individuals and mid-sized tech companies on assets management and financial restructuring. He told me he prefers it that way. It gives him more flexibility and allows for deeper, more personal client relationships. Independent wealth management specialist. No firm to verify his credentials. No colleagues to casually look up. I kept my voice warm and encouraging. And I assume he's never been married? A tiny beat of hesitation. No, he said. He was just waiting for the right person. Her voice dropped to a near whisper when she said it, treating the sentiment like it was made of thin glass. That specific detail landed heavily in my chest and anchored itself there. A 44-year-old man, financially independent, well-spoken, remarkably charming enough to hold a brilliant surgeon's undivided attention for 2 hours, and he had never once been married. In my 3 decades as a federal prosecutor, I had learned that men in their mid-40s who had never committed to a single person usually fell into one of 3 distinct categories. 1. They were so pathologically consumed by their ambition that they had no room for another human being. 2. They carried deep, unhealed psychological wounds they refused to address. Or 3. They were actively hiding something that made a legally binding, long-term relationship exceptionally dangerous for them. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that a lifetime of hunting down white-collar criminals and liars had made me aggressively allergic to trust, and that it was fundamentally unfair to apply the rigid cynicism of a federal prosecutor to my daughter's budding romance. He sounds like he made quite an impression, I offered. He really did, she exhaled, and I could practically hear the smile radiating through the phone. Look, I know it's only been a week. I'm trying not to read too much into it. I just wanted to tell someone who would understand why this feels important. My throat tightened because I did understand. She was 33 years old. She spent her days holding the lives of children in her hands, bearing unimaginable stress and returning to a silent, empty apartment. She had filled her schedule so completely that there was no room left for the crushing loneliness that creeps in at 2 in the morning. She wanted to share her happiness with her father without being subjected to a cross-examination about the man's financial history. And I had just asked her 3 probing questions right out of the gate. I am truly happy for you, Sarah, I said, putting absolute sincerity into my voice. I mean that. I know you do. A brief pause. He wants to meet you, Dad. He told me that family is incredibly important to him, and he wants to do things the right traditional way. I leaned back in my heavy wooden chair and stared out the window at the dark expanse of the estate, the faint outline of the timberline barely visible against the starless February sky. Tell him to come down to the estate, I said smoothly. We'll have a nice dinner. Really? The profound relief in her voice hit me like a physical blow. She had been bracing for resistance. She had fully expected me to be overly cautious, to hedge my bets, to demand a background check. And perhaps, given my profession, she was entirely right to expect it. Really, I assured her. Any man who can make my daughter sound this happy on a random Tuesday in February deserves a fair hearing. She laughed again, and we spent the next 20 minutes talking about ordinary, safe things. Her upcoming surgical schedule, the erratic Boston weather, the fence repairs Henry Cobb had been delaying. After we finally hung up, I sat alone in the massive kitchen for a very long time. My coffee grew cold, the property tax documents lay ignored. The absolute silence of the 450-acre estate settled heavily around me. Julian Thorne, 44, independent wealth management, West Coast, unspecified. Never married. I picked up my pen, turned over a blank sheet of paper, and wrote the name Julian Thorne in precise block letters. I stared at the ink for a long while, Catherine's warning echoing louder than ever. I folded the paper, slipped it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, and decided it was time to start verifying. May arrived at the Shenandoah Ridge estate the way it always does, sudden, vibrant, and overwhelmingly green. The dogwoods bloomed in brilliant white clusters along the main driveway, and the air grew thick with the sweet, heavy scent of damp earth and fresh-cut pasture grass. I had been awake since 5 a.m. that Saturday, riding the eastern fence line in the old farm truck with Henry Cobb to check on a calf that had been struggling. Henry, a man who viewed unnecessary conversation as a personal insult, merely pointed out a sagging wire, grunted his disapproval of the spring mud, and drove us back to the barn in silence. I appreciated his demeanor. Some mornings a man needs the quiet more than he needs idle chatter. By noon, I had set the massive oak table on the wraparound back porch, placed a seasoned brisket in the smoker, and changed into a clean-pressed button-down shirt. Sarah arrived first, driving her SUV down from the city. She hurried through the front door, carrying a large container of her mother's famous potato salad, a recipe she had painstakingly recreated from memory, and set it on the kitchen island without a word. It was one of those small, heavy gestures people make when they are carrying emotional weight they don't want to verbalize. "He's about 10 minutes out," she announced, stopping to straighten her light jacket in the hallway mirror. Her hands fluttered nervously, adjusting her collar twice when once was perfectly sufficient. Sarah was a surgeon who operated on infantile hearts. She did not get nervous. "He's going to be absolutely fine," I said gently, leaning against the doorframe. She met my eyes in the mirror. "I'm not worried about him, Dad. I'm worried about you." Before I could formulate a reassuring response, the distinct crunch of tires on the long gravel driveway interrupted us. Julian Thorne stepped out of a slate-gray Range Rover. It was a model perhaps 3 years old, immaculately clean, but deliberately not brand new. It was exactly the kind of vehicle a man drives when he wants to project quiet success without appearing ostentatious or desperate for attention. Julian was tall, athletic, and possessed the kind of effortless, broad-shouldered posture that comes from years of walking into boardrooms full of wealthy strangers and instantly putting them at ease. His dark hair was impeccably styled, just beginning to gray at the temples. He walked up the steps carrying a bottle of Blanton's single-barrel bourbon, an expensive, highly respected choice that proved he had done his homework on Virginia hospitality, but not so outrageously expensive that it looked like a bribe. He extended his hand, meeting my gaze with direct, unwavering confidence. "Mr. Vance, it is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you." Sarah talks about this estate like it's her own personal paradise. I can certainly see why. His grip was firm, dry, and perfectly calibrated. His smile reached all the way to his eyes, creating genuine-looking crinkles at the corners. "Welcome to Shenandoah Ridge, Julian," I said, matching his grip. "Come on in." We spent the hour before dinner walking the grounds. I showed him the cattle pastures, the timber line, and the stretch of the river that bordered the western edge. Julian asked all the right questions. He asked about the soil conservation easements, the intricacies of the timber harvest schedule, and the fluctuating market prices for Black Angus. He used the correct terminology. He knew the difference between a cow-calf operation and a stocker operation. "You seem to know your way around an agricultural estate," I noted, watching him casually step over a muddy patch without looking down. "I've managed assets for a few large-scale agricultural families on the West Coast," he replied smoothly, his tone entirely conversational. "When you manage their wealth, you have to understand exactly how they generate it. You pick things up." Sarah walked beside him, her shoulder occasionally brushing against his arm. She was watching him with an intensity that bordered on fragile, the way someone watches a beautiful dream, terrified they might suddenly wake up. It made my chest ache in a profound, protective way. We ate dinner on the back porch as the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the rolling hills. The brisket was perfect, and Julian complimented it with enough specific detail about the smoke ring and the bark to suggest he genuinely understood the process. "This is incredible," he said, taking another bite. "You can't get anything close to this in the city, no matter how much they charge you for the aesthetic." Sarah beamed. I smiled politely and watched his hands. I watched how he held his fork, how he mirrored my posture, how he perfectly paced his eating to match ours. Over the course of the meal, Julian talked about his wealth management practice. He described his work with a polished, measured intelligence. He casually referenced two complex corporate restructuring deals in California, providing just enough technical detail to sound exceptionally credible, but adhering to client confidentiality to avoid naming any specific companies or individuals that could be verified. He analyzed current market trends with a sophisticated insight that signaled extreme competence without ever crossing the line into arrogance. He was good. He was flawlessly, professionally good, and that was precisely what made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. In my 30 years as a federal prosecutor, I had cross-examined hundreds of white-collar criminals, corrupt executives, and expert witnesses. The ones who were lying were almost always significantly more polished than the ones who were telling the truth. Truth is often messy. It involves hesitation, forgotten details, and awkward pauses. Deception, on the other hand, is rehearsed. It is a performance. Julian Thorne never stumbled. He never searched for a word. He never once contradicted himself, not even on the most trivial detail. Every answer he gave connected perfectly to the previous one, like a meticulously constructed chain of evidence designed by a master architect. At exactly 7:15 p.m., his phone buzzed quietly in his jacket pocket. He glanced at the screen, his expression remaining perfectly neutral. "Please excuse me for just one moment," he said, offering an apologetic smile. "I have a client on the West Coast dealing with a sudden liquidity issue. They tend to panic when the markets close." He stood up, walked to the far end of the expansive porch, and turned his back to us. I watched him intently. His left hand gripped the wooden railing. His shoulders instantly pulled inward, hunching slightly. A posture I recognized immediately. It was the involuntary physical contraction of a person receiving information they desperately did not want to hear. His right hand came up and cut sharply through the air in a short, aggressive, chopping motion. It was not the gesture of a wealth manager gently calming an anxious client. It was the furious, commanding gesture of a man giving explicit orders that were being disobeyed. Though his voice was far too low to hear, his body language screamed of tightly controlled rage. Then he abruptly turned around and caught me watching him. What happened in the next fraction of a second was the most terrifyingly honest thing I saw from Julian Thorne that entire evening. It was a reset, a lightning-fast, highly practiced micro-expression. The severe tension vanished from his shoulders instantly. His hand dropped loosely to his side. His facial features rearranged themselves with alarming speed, transforming back into the easy, charming, confident mask he had been wearing all afternoon. He casually strolled back to the table and took his seat. "My apologies," he said smoothly, picking up his bourbon glass. "A minor crisis averted. The logistics of transferring large sums can make people unreasonably anxious." "I understand completely," I replied, my voice devoid of inflection. Sarah smiled at him sympathetically. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. Without hesitation, she turned her palm up and laced her fingers through his. The automatic, unconscious gesture of two people who had already established a deep physical and emotional bond. I looked away, staring out at the darkening pasture, the cold knot of suspicion in my gut twisting into an absolute certainty. Later that night, after Julian's Range Rover had disappeared down the long gravel driveway, Sarah found me sitting alone on the porch with the last of the bourbon. "Well?" she asked. Her voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the desperate hope vibrating beneath it. "He's very impressive," I said, and I meant every syllable. She let out a long, shuddering breath, the tension leaving her body. "I'm so glad you think so, Dad." She hugged me tightly and went inside to pack her things. I remained on the porch in the darkness for a very long time, listening to the crickets and thinking about a man who could completely alter his emotional state in half a second. A man who never let his guard down. A man who was entirely too perfect. Catherine's voice echoed in the stillness of the Virginia night, clearer than ever. "Trust, but verify, Thomas." I reached into my pocket and touched the folded piece of paper with Julian's name on it. I was done trusting. Tomorrow, the verification would begin. Over the next 4 months, Julian Thorne integrated himself into the fabric of our family with a seamless, terrifying efficiency. Summer bled into a breathtaking Virginia autumn, and Julian became a permanent fixture at the Shenandoah Ridge estate. He drove down from the city nearly every weekend, always arriving with the exact right gift: a rare book on historical federal prosecutions for my study, a specialized surgical journal for Sarah, a box of premium cigars for Henry Cobb, which the old estate manager accepted with a grunt that closely approximated approval. Julian did not just visit, he participated. He rolled up the sleeves of his expensive linen shirts and helped Henry mend the eastern fence line. He stood in the sweltering heat of the July sun, swinging a hammer with practiced ease, sweating through his clothes while trading dry jokes with the ranch hands. He was entirely too good at being a regular, hard-working man. He possessed an uncanny ability to adapt his personality to perfectly match whoever he was speaking to. With Sarah, he was deeply empathetic and intellectually stimulating. With Henry, he was stoic, respectful, and hard-working. With me, he played the role of the earnest, intelligent, respectful younger man who sought out my wisdom and valued my extensive experience. It was a flawless performance, and it terrified me. In my 3 decades at the Justice Department, I had learned that true sociopathy does not manifest as outward cruelty. It manifests as extreme, weaponized adaptability. A genuine person has edges. They have bad days, they say the wrong thing, they misread a room, they let their fatigue show. Julian never did. Every single interaction was perfectly calibrated to elicit maximum trust and affection. He was a mirror, reflecting exactly what each of us wanted to see. Sarah, of course, saw none of this. She was radiantly, unconditionally happy. The exhaustion that had shadowed her eyes for the past 4 years had completely vanished. She practically glowed. She looked at Julian with an absolute, uncompromising adoration that made my heart ache with a protective terror. I knew that if I was right about him, the inevitable revelation would not just break her heart. It would completely destroy her ability to ever trust anyone again. I had to be absolutely certain before I moved against him. I could not rely on my instincts alone. I needed cold, hard, irrefutable federal evidence. The morning after Julian helped Henry fix the fence, I locked myself in my study, a room lined with heavy mahogany shelves and the accumulated files of a 30-year career. I poured myself a black coffee, sat at my desk, and picked up my secure phone. I dialed a number I hadn't called in over 3 years. It belonged to Richard Kinsley. Kinsley and I had worked together on a massive multi-state wire fraud task force in the late 90s. He was a former FBI forensic accountant who had eventually left the bureau to start a highly exclusive private intelligence firm in Washington. He was paranoid, brilliant, and possessed an unmatched ability to find the financial ghosts that wealthy criminals attempted to bury. Vance, Kinsley's voice crackled through the receiver, sounding exactly as gravelly and cynical as I remembered. I thought you retired to play cowboy in the mountains. Tell me you aren't calling to ask about tax loopholes for cattle feed. I need you to look into someone, Dick, I said, skipping the pleasantries. Quietly, very quietly, it's personal. There was a brief pause on the line. The shift in Kinsley's demeanor was palpable. The cynical banter vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused attention of a predator catching a scent. Give me the name. Julian Thorne. He claims to be 44. Independent wealth management specialist, operating mostly out of New York, but he says his clients are primarily on the West Coast. He handles high net worth individuals and corporate restructuring. I relayed every single detail I had gathered from Julian over the past few months. The car he drove, the watch he wore, the specific terminology he used when discussing asset liquidation, and the brand of bourbon he preferred. I want everything you can find, I continued, my voice low and tight. I want his financial history, his client list, his real estate holdings, and his tax returns. But more importantly, Dick, I want to know what isn't there. He's too clean. He's too perfect. Find out where the dirt is buried. Give me 10 days, Kinsley said. If this guy is a ghost, I'll find his haunting grounds. The 10 days that followed were an exercise in excruciating psychological endurance. I had to sit across the dinner table from Julian Thorne, smile at his jokes, drink his expensive bourbon, and pretend I was welcoming him into my family, all while knowing I had unleashed a federal bloodhound on his trail. I played the role of the supportive, oblivious father perfectly. I had to. If Julian suspected for a single second that I was investigating him, he would disappear, and whatever trap he was setting for Sarah would be sprung before I could stop him. On the evening of the 9th day, Kinsley called me back. I was sitting on the back porch watching a storm roll in over the timberline. The air was heavy with the smell of ozone and impending rain. "You always did have the instincts of a paranoid bastard, Thomas," Kinsley said, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in his voice. "Your boy is a phantom." "Tell me," I demanded, gripping the phone tightly. "Julian Thorne exists on paper," Kinsley explained, the sound of typing softly in the background dying. "He has a social security number, a pristine credit score, and legitimate investments. He pays his taxes. He has an LLC registered in Delaware for his wealth management practice. On the surface, he is exactly who he claims to be. But here is the problem, Thomas. The paper trail is shallow. It only goes back 15 years. Before 2011, Julian Thorne essentially did not exist. There are no college transcripts, no medical records, no property leases, not even a parking ticket. It is a manufactured identity, built meticulously over the last decade. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through my chest. A burn identity. Exactly, Kinsley confirmed. It's high-level professional work. Whoever built this identity knew exactly how the federal databases interact. I ended the call, staring out at the approaching storm. Julian Thorne was a dangerous predator, and my daughter was his unsuspecting, trusting prey. The engagement party was scheduled for late October, a grand affair to be held at the Shenandoah Ridge Estate. The crisp autumn air was perfect for an outdoor celebration, and Sarah threw herself into the planning with an energy I hadn't seen since her medical school graduation. To the outside observer, it was a flawless picture of modern romance. But to me, every smile, every gentle touch, every perfectly timed joke was a calculated move in a high-stakes chess match I was determined to win. The most critical element of the weekend was the arrival of Julian's parents. They were supposedly retired academics. William, a former professor of economic history, and Beatrice, a retired architect. They flew in 2 days before the party, renting a luxury sedan to drive up from Dulles. When they arrived, I was waiting on the front porch, observing them with the intense predatory focus of a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. William Thorne stepped out of the car first. He was a distinguished-looking man in his late 60s, with a neat silver beard, wearing a tweed blazer that perfectly fit the academic persona. Beatrice followed, elegantly dressed in understated, expensive cashmere, her smile warm and seemingly genuine. They embraced Julian with the appropriate amount of parental affection, greeted Sarah with enthusiastic warmth, and approached me with hands extended. "Thomas, it is such an immense pleasure to finally meet you," William said, his voice possessing a rich, cultured timbre. "Julian has told us so much about this magnificent estate, but his descriptions truly didn't do it justice." "Welcome to Shenandoah Ridge," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. His grip was practiced, his eye contact steady. "We are thrilled to have you here to celebrate." That evening, I hosted an intimate dinner for the 5 of us in the formal dining room, a space we rarely used since Catherine's passing. The mahogany table was set with our finest crystal and silver. As the wine flowed and the conversation warmed, I began my subtle interrogation. I did not attack directly, a good prosecutor never does. Instead, I asked open-ended questions, encouraging them to fill the silence with details. I asked about their time in California, their academic careers, and Julian's childhood. They were good. They were exceptionally, terrifyingly good. They possessed a wealth of anecdotes about a young Julian, his supposed early fascination with numbers, his teenage rebellion that consisted of reading financial journals instead of going to parties, the family vacations to Lake Tahoe. They finished each other's sentences seamlessly, laughing at the right moments, projecting an aura of a deeply connected, loving family. But to a man who had spent 30 years dismantling rehearsed testimony, the cracks began to show. The first crack appeared during the main course. I asked William a highly specific question about the economic history department at the university he supposedly taught at, referencing a controversial curriculum change that had made national news a decade ago. William answered smoothly, detailing the bureaucratic nightmare it caused. However, as he spoke, I watched Beatrice. Her eyes remained fixed on William, completely unblinking, her breathing unnaturally shallow. It was the micro-expression of an accomplice monitoring a partner, navigating a dangerous lie, desperately waiting for them to safely cross the tightrope. A genuine spouse would have been eating her meal, perhaps rolling her eyes at a familiar story. Beatrice was on high alert. The second, more damning crack occurred over dessert. I steered the conversation toward Julian's high school years. Julian mentioned he spent a lot of time on the water growing up, I said casually, swirling the wine in my glass. Did he sail out of the Coronado Yacht Club down there? Julian had never mentioned sailing, nor had he ever mentioned Coronado. It was a complete fabrication on my part, a classic perjury trap designed to test their synchronization. William smiled warmly, not missing a beat. Oh, constantly. We practically had to drag him off the boats. He and his friends were always causing trouble down by the docks in Coronado. Actually, Julian interjected, his voice remaining perfectly smooth but a microscopic fraction of a second too fast. Dad is misremembering. It wasn't Coronado. Thomas, it was the Mission Bay Yacht Club. Coronado was where we went for Sunday dinners. William's expression did not change, but his left hand, resting on the table, twitched slightly. He gave a self-deprecating chuckle. Right. Mission Bay. My memory isn't what it used to be. The years tend to blend together. It was a masterful recovery by Julian, flawlessly executed to cover William's mistake. To Sarah, it looked like a normal, slightly embarrassing family correction. To me, it was a glaring neon sign of guilt. They were hired actors. They had memorized a dossier, a comprehensive backstory created to legitimize Julian Thorne, but they could not adapt to unpredictable variables the way Julian could. They were sticking to a script, and I had just introduced a line they hadn't rehearsed. I knew, with absolute certainty, that the people sitting at my dinner table were frauds. The confirmation of my suspicions solidified later that night. The house had gone quiet, the guests retiring to their respective rooms. I had retreated to my study, but found myself unable to sleep, the adrenaline of the evening coursing through my veins. Around 2 in the morning, I walked silently down the carpeted hallway toward the kitchen to get a glass of water. As I passed the French doors leading to the side patio, I heard a low, aggressive voice cutting through the stillness of the night. I stopped, pressing my back flat against the wall, perfectly concealed in the shadows. Through the glass, I could see Julian pacing on the stone patio, holding a dark burner-style phone to his ear. The charming, perfect fiancé had completely vanished. The man on the patio moved with a predatory, coiled tension. I don't care what the timeline was, Julian hissed into the phone, his voice dripping with a venomous authority I had never heard him use. The old man is asking too many specific questions. He is a former prosecutor, and his instincts are waking up. You need to accelerate the trust modification documents immediately. Have them ready for signature by the morning after the engagement party. Once the ink is dry, we initiate the wire transfer and liquidate the designated assets. I slid deeper into the shadows, a cold fury settling over me as I realized the true scale of his deception. It was mid-August when Julian's parents, Richard and Eleanor Thorne, arrived at the Shenandoah Ridge estate for a highly anticipated weekend visit. According to Julian, they were retired academics who had spent their careers teaching European history at a small, prestigious liberal arts college in the Pacific Northwest. They arrived in a rented Lincoln Navigator, stepping onto the gravel driveway with an air of practiced, understated elegance that mirrored their son's perfectly calibrated persona. Richard was a tall, distinguished-looking man with a carefully trimmed silver beard, wearing a tweed blazer despite the stifling Virginia humidity. Eleanor possessed a sharp avian grace, dressed in muted earth tones and carrying a vintage leather handbag that suggested generational wealth rather than recent acquisition. From the moment they crossed the threshold, their performance was flawless. They were warm, engaging, and remarkably knowledgeable about everything from 19th-century agrarian reform to the specific challenges of maintaining a 450-acre cattle operation. Sarah was utterly captivated. She spent the entire Saturday afternoon walking them through the gardens, explaining the intricate history of the estate's original landscaping, while Julian watched her, with an expression of profound, manufactured adoration. I played the gracious host, serving sweet tea on the veranda and nodding politely as Richard delivered a lengthy, eloquent anecdote about a sabbatical they had supposedly taken in Tuscany during the late 90s. But as a former federal prosecutor who had spent 30 years dismantling complex fabrications, I watched them with the cold, detached precision of a predator studying its prey. When people construct a false reality, they invariably overprepare the major details. They memorize the grand narratives, the impressive backstories, and the sweeping historical timelines. What they inevitably neglect are the microscopic, connective tissues of shared human experience, the unconscious, nonverbal cues that bind a genuine family together. I noticed the first anomaly during dinner on Saturday evening. We were seated in the formal dining room, the heavy mahogany table set with Catherine's best silver and crystal. Sarah was laughing at something Eleanor had said, the candlelight reflecting in her bright, hopeful eyes. I watched Richard reach across the table for the salt shaker. As he did, his cuff pulled back, revealing a faded, highly specific tattoo on the inside of his left wrist, a complex geometric pattern that looked remarkably similar to the insignia of a known, organized criminal syndicate operating out of the West Coast. He caught me looking and immediately snapped his cuff back into place, a flash of genuine, unadulterated hostility crossing his features before he instantly replaced it with a genial smile. The second anomaly was far more subtle but equally devastating. Throughout the 2-hour meal, Richard and Eleanor never once exhibited the unconscious synchronization of a couple who had been married for 40 years. They never anticipated each other's movements. When Eleanor dropped her napkin, Richard didn't instinctively reach to pick it up. When Richard paused in the middle of a story, Eleanor didn't unconsciously fill in the missing word. They interacted with the polite, calculated distance of two highly trained professionals executing a coordinated operation. They were not husband and wife, they were colleagues. The final, undeniable confirmation occurred later that night. The house had grown quiet, the suffocating heat of the day finally giving way to the cool, settling darkness of the Virginia countryside. Sarah had retired to her room and the Thorns were supposedly asleep in the guest wing. I was sitting in my dimly lit study, reviewing a stack of veterinary invoices, the heavy oak door left slightly ajar. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard the distinct, muted creak of the floorboards in the hallway. I froze, my breathing slowing to a silent, measured rhythm. I stood up, moved silently to the door, and peered through the narrow crack. Julian was standing in the shadows near the grand staircase, a burner phone pressed tightly to his ear. His posture was rigid, his broad shoulders hunched inward in that same, violently contracted stance I had witnessed on the porch months earlier. The easy, charming mask had completely vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, calculating, ruthless intent. "I don't care what the timeline is," Julian hissed into the phone, his voice a lethal, barely audible whisper. "You push the liquidation schedule up. We don't have another 6 months. The old man is watching me. He smiles and pours the bourbon, but he's looking right through me. He's a Fed, and he hasn't forgotten how to hunt. If we don't finalize the trust modification by the wedding, this whole structure collapses." There was a pause as the person on the other end responded. Julian's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking visibly beneath his skin. "The parents are fine," Julian snapped, dismissing the concern with a wave of his hand. "They're playing their parts perfectly. But we need the California entity incorporated by Tuesday. Once the decoy accounts are established and the corporate veil is in place, he can't touch us without triggering a massive jurisdictional nightmare. Just get the paperwork finalized. I'll handle the daughter." He terminated the call abruptly, slipped the burner phone into his pocket, and stood in the darkness for a long moment, staring blankly at the wall. Then he took a deep, steadying breath, rolled his shoulders back, and visibly reconstructed the persona of Julian Thorne. The loving fiancé, the successful wealth manager, the perfect son-in-law. It was a terrifying, masterful transformation. I watched him walk silently back to his room, my heart pounding a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs. The parameters of the game had fundamentally changed. This was no longer a vague, lingering suspicion about a man's background. This was a highly organized, professionally executed conspiracy designed to infiltrate my family, systematically dismantle our financial security, and destroy my daughter's life. Julian Thorne was not merely a fraud. He was an apex predator, and he was hunting inside my home. I retreated to my desk, my mind shifting effortlessly back into the cold strategic gears of a federal prosecutor preparing for war. He wanted a jurisdictional nightmare. He wanted to manipulate trust law and hide behind complex corporate structures. I knew exactly how to dismantle him, but I couldn't do it alone. I needed undeniable, documented evidence, and I needed it before the wedding. The trap had been set, but the jaws had not yet snapped shut. I just needed to give him enough rope to hang himself, and I needed to ensure that when the hammer finally fell, it would obliterate him completely. The suffocating humidity of late August hung heavy over the Shenandoah Ridge estate, thick and oppressive, mirroring the unseen tension that had coiled itself around the foundations of our family. Since overhearing Julian's midnight phone call, I had moved with the deliberate, agonizing patience of a hunter stalking a highly dangerous predator. I hadn't said a word to Sarah. To alert her without possessing ironclad, irrefutable evidence would have been a catastrophic tactical error. Julian had spent months meticulously cultivating her trust, wrapping himself around her emotional vulnerabilities with surgical precision. If I accused him based solely on an overheard conversation, he would effortlessly spin it as the paranoid delusions of an overprotective, grieving father, and I would risk alienating the only person I was trying to save. I needed undeniable proof. I needed the smoking gun. That proof arrived on a violently stormy Tuesday afternoon, delivered not by my covert investigation, but by a simple mundane twist of fate. Sarah had taken the week off from the hospital to finalize the rapidly approaching wedding arrangements. The house was a chaotic whirlwind of floral swatches, seating charts, and catering menus. Julian had driven into Washington, D.C. early that morning for what he claimed was an emergency meeting with a high-net-worth client, leaving his sleek, silver laptop sitting innocuously on the heavy mahogany dining table. It was a rare, careless mistake from a man who meticulously controlled every aspect of his environment, likely brought on by the intense pressure of accelerating his fraudulent timeline. Around 2 o'clock, the sky bruised a deep, angry purple, and a massive thunderstorm rolled over the Blue Ridge Mountains. The power flickered ominously before the estate's backup generator kicked in with a low, vibrating hum. Sarah was sitting in the living room, frantically trying to finalize a playlist for the reception, when her own aging laptop suddenly emitted a sharp, metallic click and abruptly died, the victim of a catastrophic hard drive failure exacerbated by the power surge. Frustrated and desperate to send an urgent email to the florist before their 3 o'clock deadline, she walked into the dining room and opened Julian's laptop. She didn't intend to snoop. She didn't harbor any secret suspicions. She simply needed a functioning internet connection for 5 minutes. The screen flickered to life, revealing that Julian had neglected to log out of his user session. The desktop was cluttered with complex financial modeling software and secured client folders. But what immediately caught Sarah's eye was a single open Excel spreadsheet dominating the center of the screen. It wasn't a wedding budget. It wasn't a standard portfolio review. The document was titled Project Shenandoah Liquidation Timelina del XLS. Sarah frowned, leaning closer to the screen, the pale blue light illuminating the sudden stark confusion on her face. She was a brilliant surgeon, possessing an intellect trained to analyze complex, interconnected systems. It took her less than 60 seconds to comprehend the devastating reality of the numbers laid out before her. The spreadsheet was a masterfully detailed, ruthlessly efficient blueprint for the systematic dismantling and liquidation of the Vance family trust. It outlined a staggering $75 million in total assets, including the Shenandoah Ridge estate, our diversified equity portfolios, and the substantial life insurance payouts from Catherine's passing. Every single asset had been meticulously cataloged, assigned a risk value, and paired with a specific timeline for extraction. Her eyes darted across the columns, her breath catching in her throat as she read the chillingly clinical descriptions. There was a section dedicated to the co-trustee modification. Scheduled to be executed 3 days before the wedding, which would grant Julian unilateral authority to move funds without my signature. There was a detailed schematic for a series of offshore shell companies, primarily based in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus, designed to launder the liquidated assets through multiple jurisdictions, rendering them practically untraceable. But the most horrifying section of the document was a small highlighted column on the far right, ominously labeled Post-Extraction Contingencies. It contained cold, calculated notes on how to handle the inevitable legal fallout. One note explicitly detailed a strategy to challenge my mental competency in federal court, using my grief over Catherine's death as leverage to have me declared unfit, thereby cementing his control over the estate. Another note simply read, S.V. Pacification Strategy, maintain marital illusion for 14 months post-extraction to delay FBI involvement. He wasn't planning a life with her, he was planning a 14-month hostage situation to cover his tracks. A cold, paralyzing numbness washed over Sarah. The man she had loved, the man who had held her as she cried over her mother's grave, the man who had promised her a lifetime of safety and devotion, did not exist. Julian Thorne was a meticulously constructed phantom, a weapon designed to destroy her. Every tender touch, every whispered promise, every shared laugh had been a calculated deposit in a massive sociopathic con. She felt a sudden, violent wave of nausea rise in her chest. Her hands began to shake uncontrollably, her fingers hovering over the trackpad as the agonizing truth shattered the foundation of her reality. She wanted to scream. She wanted to hurl the laptop through the nearest window. She wanted to collapse onto the floor and weep until she couldn't breathe. Instead, she did exactly what she had been trained to do in a surgical crisis when a child's heart suddenly stops beating on the operating table. She compartmentalized the terror. She shoved the agonizing, suffocating betrayal into a dark corner of her mind, locking it away behind an impenetrable wall of pure crystalline focus. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity that mirrored the exact demeanor I had utilized for 30 years in a federal courtroom. She was, after all, her father's daughter. Her hands stopped shaking. Moving with rapid, deliberate precision, she pulled a small USB flash drive from her pocket. She normally used to transfer medical scans and plugged it into the side of Julian's laptop. She quickly copied the Project Shenandoah Liquidation Tamilian Docs Leslie file, along with 2 other suspicious folders labeled California and Docs and Decoy Trust Routing. As the progress bar crept toward 100%, the sound of tires crunching on the wet gravel driveway echoed through the house. Julian had returned early. Sarah's heart slammed against her ribs, but her expression remained completely impassive. She safely ejected the flash drive, slipped it into her pocket, and closed the laptop, ensuring it was positioned exactly as she had found it. She walked calmly into the kitchen, picked up a damp cloth, and began wiping down the granite countertops just as the front door swung open. Julian walked in, shaking the rain from his expensive umbrella, that familiar, effortless smile spreading across his handsome face. The traffic on the Beltway was an absolute nightmare, he said, walking over and pressing a gentle kiss to her temple. How is the wedding planning coming along, my love? Sarah looked up at the man who was actively plotting to destroy her family. She met his gaze with a smile so perfectly warm, so completely devoid of suspicion, that it would have chilled a federal prosecutor to the bone. It's going perfectly, Julian, she lied, her voice steady and sweet. Everything is falling exactly into place. It was the Thursday evening before the engagement party when the meticulously constructed illusion of Julian Thorne finally began to fracture. The fracture did not start with Julian himself, who remained as impeccably polished and maddeningly composed as ever. The break occurred within my daughter. Over the past several months, Sarah had blossomed under the warmth of Julian's manufactured affection, displaying a radiant happiness that had temporarily blinded her to the subtle inconsistencies I had been quietly cataloging. But when she arrived at the Shenandoah Ridge estate 2 days early for the celebration, the radiance was entirely gone. I was in my study, reviewing a stack of property line adjustments, when I heard her car pull onto the gravel driveway. I walked out to the front porch to greet her, expecting the usual whirlwind of excitement that accompanied her visits. Instead, Sarah stepped out of her vehicle, moving with the stiff, mechanical precision of someone walking to an execution. She was pale, her eyes rimmed with red, and she possessed a fragile, haunted look that instantly transported me back to the agonizing days following her mother's cancer diagnosis. "Sarah?" I called out, my heart hammering a sudden frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What's wrong?" She didn't answer immediately. She walked up the wooden steps, bypassed my outstretched arms, and walked straight into the house. I followed her into the kitchen, the very room where she had first told me about Julian all those months ago. She dropped her overnight bag onto the hardwood floor with a heavy thud, leaned against the granite island, and finally looked at me. The devastation in her eyes was absolute. "You were right," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You were right about him, Dad, from the very beginning." I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. The instinct of the federal prosecutor, the detached analytical machine that had defined my career, instantly took over, pushing the terrified father aside. I stepped closer, keeping my voice incredibly steady and calm. "Tell me exactly what happened, Sarah. Start from the beginning." She took a shaky breath, wrapping her arms around her torso as if she were trying to hold herself together physically. "It happened on Tuesday night in Boston," she began, her words trembling slightly. "Julian had come over to my apartment. We were supposed to be finalizing the guest list for this weekend. He was in the shower, I was sitting at the kitchen counter, and my phone was charging in the bedroom. I remembered I needed to send an urgent email to the pediatric oncology department regarding a surgical schedule for the next morning. Julian's laptop was sitting open on the counter. He never leaves it open, Dad. Never. He always closes it, even if he's just stepping out of the room for a minute. But this time he didn't. I nodded slowly, encouraging her to continue. "You used his laptop to send the email." "I tried," she said, a bitter, hollow laugh escaping her lips. "I woke the screen. I was going to open a browser window, but an Excel spreadsheet was already maximized on the screen. I didn't mean to pry. I swear to you, I didn't mean to snoop. He had our routing numbers, Dad. He had the names of our estate attorneys. But that wasn't the worst part." She paused, wiping her face with the back of her hand, struggling to regain her composure. I waited, giving her the silent space she needed. "The worst part," she continued, her voice hardening with a sudden fierce anger, "was the timeline. The spreadsheet was divided into columns based on execution dates. The final column was labeled Total Liquidation and Transfer. The target date was exactly 30 days after our wedding. He wasn't planning a life with me, Dad. He was planning a hostile takeover. The total estimated value at the bottom of the spreadsheet was $75 million. I stood perfectly still, absorbing the sheer, terrifying scale of the betrayal. Julian Thorne was not merely a gold digger, hoping to marry into wealth and live comfortably. He was a professional, highly sophisticated corporate predator. He had spent months meticulously mapping our financial vulnerabilities, charming his way past our defenses, and positioning himself to drain the trust dry before we even realized what was happening. "Did he catch you looking at it?" I asked sharply, my mind already racing through federal statutes, jurisdictional boundaries, and potential wire fraud charges. "No," Sarah replied, shaking her head. "I heard the shower turn off. I minimized the spreadsheet, opened a browser, and sent my email just as he walked into the kitchen." I smiled at him. I kissed him. I pretended everything was perfectly normal. I have spent the last 48 hours playing the role of the blushing, excited bride-to-be, all while knowing that the man sleeping next to me is a monster. She broke down then, sobbing into her hands. I crossed the kitchen and pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as she cried out the grief, the humiliation, and the profound loss of the future she thought she was building. I stroked her hair, staring blindly at the kitchen wall, feeling a slow, icy rage building in my chest. "I have to cancel the party," she murmured against my shoulder. "I have to call everyone and tell them it's off. I can't look at him, Dad. I can't stand up there and pretend." "No," I said, my voice resonating with an authority I hadn't used since my days in the courtroom. She pulled back, looking up at me in shock. "What do you mean, no? You want me to go through with the engagement party, after what I just told you?" "Sarah, listen to me very carefully," I said, framing her face with my hands, forcing her to meet my eyes. If you cancel the party, Julian will instantly know that we are onto him. A man this sophisticated, this calculating, will disappear into the wind before the sun sets. He will destroy his hard drives, burn his burner phones, and vanish. He will find another wealthy family, another brilliant, vulnerable daughter, and he will do this to them. We are not going to let him walk away. We are going to build a federal case against him, and we are going to bury him. The Shenandoah Ridge estate had been completely transformed by Saturday evening. The expansive back lawn, which usually offered nothing but unobstructed views of the timberline and grazing cattle, was now dominated by a massive white marquee tent. Warm golden string lights draped elegantly across the canvas ceiling, illuminating a sea of linen-covered tables and elaborate floral arrangements. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their music floating over the low, sophisticated murmur of 100 well-dressed guests. Caterers in crisp black uniforms navigated the crowd, balancing silver trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvre. It was, by every objective measure, the perfect engagement party. Julian Thorne was in his absolute element. He moved through the crowd with effortless grace, his tuxedo tailored to perfection, his smile devastatingly charismatic. He shook hands with my former colleagues from the Justice Department, charmed the local circuit court judges, and laughed at all the right moments when the hospital administrators from Boston told their tedious stories. He played the role of the devoted, successful, entirely unthreatening future son-in-law with a terrifying mastery. From my vantage point near the carved ice sculpture, I watched him meticulously. The icy rage that had bloomed in my chest on Thursday night was now fully suppressed, locked behind the practiced, stoic facade of a veteran prosecutor. Sarah was performing brilliantly as well. She remained tethered to his side, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, laughing at his jokes and gazing up at him with what appeared to be genuine adoration. Only I could see the minute tension in her jaw, or the way her knuckles whitened slightly whenever his hand brushed against the small of her back. She was operating on pure adrenaline, executing her part of the plan flawlessly. Our plan was deceptively simple. We needed to bait the trap. We knew Julian was aiming to liquidate the Vance family trust, but a spreadsheet on a laptop was not sufficient for a federal conviction. We needed him to take a tangible, illegal action. We needed to catch him crossing the line from intent to execution. To facilitate this, I had purposefully left my private study unlocked. More importantly, I had left a stack of highly sensitive documents sitting squarely in the middle of my mahogany desk. The documents were meticulously crafted forgeries. A set of dummy trust amendments that appeared to grant sweeping co-trustee powers to the husband of the primary beneficiary upon marriage. They were legally worthless, completely void ab initio, but to a corporate raider, looking for the keys to a $75 million kingdom, they were irresistible bait. All evening I monitored the hallway leading to the study. Julian was patient. He did not rush. He spent 2 full hours cementing his flawless alibi, ensuring that dozens of influential people remembered seeing him engaged in pleasant conversation. At exactly 9 o'clock, the moment arrived. The caterers began distributing the primary champagne toast. The crowd's attention shifted toward the center of the marquee tent, gathering around the elegant tiered cake. I saw Julian lean in and whisper something in Sarah's ear. She nodded, offering him a brilliant smile, and then turned to speak to one of her bridesmaids. Julian slipped away, melting seamlessly into the shadows at the edge of the tent. He was heading for the house. I did not follow him immediately. I waited 3 agonizing minutes, counting the seconds in my head, sipping my champagne while maintaining eye contact with a retired federal judge who was complaining about golf handicaps. I raised my own glass, nodding graciously in his direction. And then Sarah leaned close to me. The smile remained frozen on her face for the benefit of the watching crowd, but beneath the facade, her body was vibrating with a chaotic electric intensity. Her hand, clutching her own champagne flute, was shaking so violently that the liquid threatened to spill over the rim. She leaned her head toward my shoulder, maintaining the optics of a tender, affectionate moment between father and daughter. But when she spoke, her voice was a sharp, frantic hiss, stripped entirely of its polished control. "Dad," she whispered, her breath hot against my ear, "call 911, right now." A profound chill ran down my spine. The words hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. This was not the script. This was a catastrophic deviation from the plan we had so carefully constructed. We were supposed to let him take photographs of the bait documents, allow him to feel secure in his deception, and wait for him to commit federal wire fraud by attempting to execute them. We needed the FBI, the financial regulatory boards, the full crushing weight of the federal justice system. We did not need local law enforcement responding to a panicked 911 call about a man taking pictures in a private study. Local police would spook him, giving him exactly the excuse he needed to burn the evidence and run. I grabbed her wrist tightly, my fingers digging into her skin just enough to ground her. I kept my smile broad, turning to face her as if we were sharing a private joke. "No," I murmured, my voice dropping to a low, commanding register that carried only to her ears. "We stick to the plan. We need a federal case, Sarah. Local police cannot hold him for photographing documents. If they show up with sirens, he destroys the laptop and we lose everything. We wait." "You don't understand," she breathed, her eyes locking onto mine with a terror so raw it made my blood run cold. She swallowed hard, struggling to force the words out without altering her serene facial expression. "I went into the hallway like you said. I looked through the crack in the door, and you saw him photographing the documents," I prompted gently, maintaining my iron grip on her wrist. "Yes," she whispered frantically. "I saw him photographing the trust documents. But that's not all I saw, Dad. When he finished with the papers, he opened the center drawer of your desk. He found your service weapon." She paused, a small, choked sob escaping her throat, completely masked by the sudden applause of the crowd as Julian finished his toast. "He took the gun, Dad. He checked the magazine, and he slipped it into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He is standing right next to me, and he is armed." The engagement party was, by all outward appearances, a masterpiece of Virginia high society. We hosted it on the sprawling back lawn of the Shenandoah Ridge estate, beneath the sprawling canopy of ancient oak trees that were strung with thousands of tiny warm white fairy lights. The evening air was perfectly crisp, carrying the faint, sweet scent of dogwood blossoms and expensive catering. A string quartet played softly near the rose garden, providing a sophisticated backdrop to the low murmur of wealthy, influential guests. Everything was meticulously curated. Everything was flawlessly executed. And everything felt like a beautifully decorated stage set for a tragedy. I stood near the edge of the patio, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that felt more like armor than celebration attire. I played the role of the gracious host, smiling and nodding as a procession of federal judges, hospital administrators, and local politicians offered their congratulations. But beneath the polished veneer, my mind was operating with the cold, calculating precision of a prosecutor building a timeline. The events of the past few weeks had painted a disturbing picture, but tonight was supposed to be about maintaining the illusion. We had to act as though everything was perfectly normal. Julian Thorne was in his absolute element. He moved through the crowd with a predatory grace, his charm turned up to a blinding wattage. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with bespoke perfection, and he knew exactly how to speak to every person in the room. He flattered the older women, engaged the powerful men with insightful, market-far commentary, and never strayed too far from Sarah. He played the role of the devoted, brilliant fiancé with such astonishing conviction that for a fleeting moment, I almost questioned my own investigative instincts. Almost. At exactly 8 o'clock, Julian tapped a silver spoon against his champagne flute. The sharp, clear ringing instantly silenced the murmuring crowd. The string quartet faded out. All eyes turned toward the center of the patio, where Julian stood beside my daughter. He slipped his arm around Sarah's waist, pulling her close in a gesture that looked incredibly tender to the untrained eye. But from where I stood, I could see the subtle rigidity in her posture. Sarah had been acting strangely all evening, a tight, forced smile plastered on her face. She had spent the last 2 days processing the terrifying implications of the encrypted spreadsheet she had discovered on Julian's laptop, a document outlining a $75 million asset liquidation plan that perfectly matched the net worth of our family trust. She had been holding herself together through sheer willpower, waiting for the right moment for us to act. But something had shifted in the last 10 minutes. She had excused herself to use the restroom inside the main house, and she had just returned, looking remarkably pale. Family, friends, and distinguished guests. Julian began, his voice projecting with smooth, practiced resonance. He raised his glass, his eyes sweeping over the crowd before settling warmly on Sarah. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate not just a union between two people, but the merging of two families, two histories, and one shared future. Sarah has brought a light into my life that I never knew I was missing. And Thomas, he turned his gaze toward me, offering a respectful nod. You have welcomed me into this magnificent home with open arms, to trust, to family, and to a future prosperity that we will build together. Cheers. The crowd echoed, a chorus of clinking crystal filling the night air. I raised my glass and smiled. It was the smile I used in the courtroom when opposing counsel made a fatal procedural error. Until Sarah suddenly stepped away from Julian's embrace. She moved through the crowd with alarming speed, her eyes locked onto mine. The forced, polite expression she had been wearing all evening had completely evaporated, replaced by raw, unadulterated terror. She reached me in seconds, grabbing my forearm with a grip so tight I could feel her fingernails pressing through the wool of my suit jacket. She leaned in close, her hand shaking violently against my arm. Her breath hitched in her throat as she whispered the words that would instantly change the trajectory of our entire lives. "Dad," she breathed, her voice trembling with an urgent, desperate panic. "Call 911. Right now." A chill ran down my spine, cold and sharp as a scalpel. My federal prosecutor instincts, honed over 3 decades of crisis management, took immediate control. The first rule of survival in a high-stakes confrontation is never to alert the target that the dynamic has shifted. I did not look at Julian, I did not reach for my phone. Instead, I placed my free hand over hers, offering a warm, paternal chuckle for the benefit of anyone watching. "Sweetheart, you look exhausted," I said loudly enough for the nearest guests to hear. "Let's get you a glass of water inside. The adrenaline of the evening is catching up with you." Before she could protest, I expertly maneuvered her away from the patio, guiding her through the French doors and into the quiet sanctuary of the main house. We moved swiftly down the hallway and into my private study. I closed the heavy oak door, engaged the brass deadbolt, and turned on the white noise generator I kept on my desk. "What happened?" I demanded, dropping the fatherly facade and adopting the precise, commanding tone of an interrogator. Sarah collapsed into the leather armchair, pressing the heels of her hands against her eyes. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving beneath her elegant silk gown. "I went inside to use the restroom," she stammered, struggling to draw a full breath. But on my way back, I noticed the door to this study was slightly cracked open. The lights were off, but there was a faint glow from inside. "Go on," I prompted, stepping closer. "It was Julian," she whispered, looking up at me with tears brimming in her eyes. "He wasn't using the restroom. He was in here, Dad. He had a small, specialized flashlight in his mouth, and he was using his phone to photograph the documents in your open safe. The original trust deeds, the bearer bonds, the signature authorization cards. I watched him meticulously flip through every single page of the estate's liquidity framework and photograph it." She stood up abruptly, her panic morphing into a frantic energy. "He's stealing it. The spreadsheet I found wasn't just a hypothetical projection, Dad. He's executing it right now. We need to call the police. We need to have him arrested for breaking into your safe." "Call 911. She reached for the antique rotary phone on my desk, but I caught her wrist. My grip was firm, unyielding. "No," I said quietly. Sarah stared at me as if I had lost my mind. "What do you mean, no?" "He is actively attempting to steal $75 million from our family. Listen to me," I commanded, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "If we call the local sheriff right now, what exactly are we going to charge him with? Trespassing in a house he was invited into? Attempted petty theft? Taking photographs of documents is not a felony, Sarah. He will hire a brilliant defense attorney, claim he was just looking for a cigar, post a $500 bail, and disappear into the wind. And we will never see him again." "So we just let him get away with it?" she cried, her voice cracking. "No," I replied, the cold, calculated fury rising in my chest. "We do not let him get away. But we do not play this game on a local level. Julian Thorne is a sophisticated predator. If we arrest him now, we just give him a slap on the wrist. I spent 30 years putting men exactly like him in federal prison. We are not going to call the police, Sarah. We are going to let him believe he is winning. She stared at me, the terror slowly giving way to a stunned realization. What are you saying? I am saying that taking a photograph is a misdemeanor, I told her, holding her gaze with absolute authority. But utilizing forged documents across state lines to alter a financial trust is federal wire fraud. We are going to build a trap. We are going to let him forge the documents, and the moment he attempts to execute the transfer, the FBI will drop a concrete vault on his head. I released her wrist and stepped back. We don't just want him arrested, Sarah. We want him destroyed. Now wipe your eyes, fix your makeup, and go back out there and smile at your fiancé. The morning after the engagement party, the Shenandoah Ridge estate was cloaked in a thick gray fog that seemed to mirror the heavy, suffocating tension inside the house. Julian had left before dawn, claiming an emergency meeting with a high-net-worth client in Manhattan. He had kissed Sarah's forehead, promised to call her that evening, and driven his Range Rover down the gravel driveway, leaving behind a profound, terrifying silence. Sarah had performed flawlessly, kissing him back with a manufactured warmth that proved she possessed the same iron-willed composure as her late mother. As soon as the taillights of his vehicle vanished into the mist, I locked the front door and walked straight into my study. It was 6:15 a.m. The game had officially shifted from observation to active prosecution, and I needed my team. I picked up the encrypted satellite phone I had kept locked in a secondary wall safe since my retirement. The local cell towers were easily monitored by anyone with sophisticated commercial hardware, and Julian Thorne was exactly the kind of man who would clone a SIM card just to be thorough. I dialed a number I had not called in over 2 years. It rang exactly twice before a gruff, alert voice answered. "Miller, David. It's Thomas Vance," I said, skipping the pleasantries. There was a brief pause on the line. Special Agent David Miller was the head of the FBI's white-collar crime division in Washington, D.C. He had been my lead investigator on 3 major racketeering cases, and he owed me a significant professional debt for saving his career during a disastrous Senate subcommittee hearing a decade ago. "Thomas," Miller replied, his tone instantly shifting into operational mode. "I thought you were raising cattle and enjoying the quiet life. What's wrong?" "I need you to pull a quiet, off-the-books background workup on a man calling himself Julian Thorne. Claims to be an independent wealth management specialist out of New York, but his roots are supposedly West Coast. He's engaged to my daughter." Miller let out a low whistle. "Thomas, I can't use bureau resources just because you don't like the guy taking your daughter to the altar. He was photographing the signature authorization cards for the Shenandoah Family Trust in my private safe last night," I stated flatly. Sarah found an encrypted spreadsheet on his laptop detailing a $75 million asset liquidation protocol. "This isn't a bad romance, David. It's a highly sophisticated, targeted financial heist. I need to know who he really is, and I need it yesterday." "Give me 2 hours," Miller said, and the line went dead. I hung up the satellite phone and immediately dialed William Hayes, my longtime estate attorney and one of the most brilliant trust architects on the Eastern Seaboard. I told him to cancel his morning appointments and drive out to the estate immediately. By 9 o'clock, William was sitting across from my desk, a cup of black coffee in his trembling hand, staring at the printouts of the spreadsheet Sarah had managed to secretly screenshot. "This is incredibly aggressive," William muttered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he studied the columns. "If these projections are accurate, he's planning to modify the primary trust structure, insert himself as a co-trustee with unilateral execution authority, and liquidate the bearer bonds and the mutual funds into a series of offshore shell companies. And he's planning to do it within a 30-day window." "How is he going to bypass the dual signature requirement?" I asked, pacing the length of the study. "The trust explicitly states that any transfer over $50,000 requires both my signature and a notarized seal. California Penal Code Section 470, William replied grimly, looking up at me. "Force. Given what he photographed in your safe last night, he has everything he needs to digitally replicate your signature and duplicate the notary stamps. He will likely draft a fraudulent amendment to the trust, naming himself as the sole executing trustee in the event of your medical incapacitation. Once he files that forged amendment with the holding banks, he can initiate the wire transfers without you ever knowing. Before I could respond, the encrypted phone on my desk buzzed. I put it on speaker. "Thomas, you there?" Miller's voice echoed in the wood-paneled room. "You were right. Julian Thorne doesn't exist. The social security number he's using belongs to a deceased infant from Oregon. His real name is Elias Montgomery. He's a ghost, Thomas. But his methodology is identical to a string of unsolved wire fraud cases spanning the last 12 years. He targets wealthy widows or the daughters of wealthy, isolated men. He integrates himself, gets his name on the legal paperwork, and the moment the assets are liquidated, he vanishes. The Bureau estimates he's taken over $40 million. But because he uses local jurisdictions and perfectly forged documents, we've never been able to nail him on a federal charge that sticks. "He's not getting away this time, David," I said, staring at the dark oak of my desk. "We are going to give him exactly what he wants." William dropped his pen. "Thomas, you cannot be serious. If he files that forged amendment, the banks will release the funds. It will be gone in seconds. Not if the trust he is amending doesn't legally exist," I countered, a dangerous smile creeping onto my face. I looked at William. "I want you to draft a new trust today. A decoy trust. We are going to quietly transfer all the actual assets into a newly chartered, heavily fortified corporate entity. Then we leave the old trust account open, completely empty, but we pad it with synthetic ledger data that the banks will verify if he checks the balances." William's eyes widened in realization. "The doctrine of void ab initio." "Exactly," I confirmed, my voice ringing with the absolute certainty of a federal prosecutor closing a trap. "Void from the beginning. The documents he intends to forge will be attached to a legally null and void trust. The moment Elias Montgomery hits send on that wire transfer, he won't be stealing a dime. But he will be transmitting fraudulent banking instructions across state lines using a digital network. That is a textbook violation of Title 18, United States Code, Section 1343. Federal wire fraud." Miller interjected from the speakerphone, a predatory excitement bleeding into his voice. 20 years in a federal penitentiary. "We are going to let him walk right up to the altar," I said, my gaze drifting to the framed photograph of Catherine on my desk. "We are going to let him put on his tuxedo, smile for the cameras, and initiate the transfer on the morning of the wedding. And when he does, David, I want your agents waiting in the vestibule." "Consider it done," Miller said. "I'll start pulling the warrants." I ended the call and looked out the window at the rolling green hills of the estate. Julian Thorne thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a wealthy, unsuspecting old man. He had no idea he had just walked into a federal courtroom, and the doors had just been locked from the outside. The federal building in downtown Richmond had not changed in the 2 years since I retired. It still smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the unique tension that permeates any space where the weight of the government is brought to bear. I walked through the security checkpoint with the ease of a man who had spent 3 decades navigating these halls, bypassing the visitor line. I was there to see Special Agent David Miller, one of the sharpest financial crimes investigators the Bureau had produced. It was a truth that could not be easily ignored. David's office was a chaotic landscape of stacked case files and whiteboards covered in complex financial diagrams. When I pushed the door open, he looked up from his monitor in surprise. We had dismantled 3 major embezzlement rings together, sharing the kind of unspoken trust forged in the trenches of federal prosecution. The sheer magnitude of the deception was difficult to fully process. "Thomas Vance," David said, standing up. "I thought you were raising cattle and ignoring the rest of the world. What brings you out of retirement?" Every passing moment seemed to stretch out into an eternity of waiting. I shook his hand firmly. "I need a favor, David. Completely off the books for now. I need a comprehensive background check on a man calling himself Julian Thorne. He claims to be an independent wealth management specialist." The quiet hum of the countryside offered a stark contrast to the storm brewing within. David's smile faded instantly, replaced by the analytical gaze of an investigator. Who is he? Thomas? Time felt entirely suspended in these fleeting, quiet moments. He's currently engaged to my daughter, I replied, and I believe he is setting up a massive financial fraud. There was no turning back from the path that had now been chosen. David gestured to the chair. Sit down. Give me everything you have. The stakes had never been higher in the history of our entire family. I laid out the meticulously gathered pieces of the puzzle. I detailed the engagement party, the spreadsheet Sarah had discovered on Julian's laptop outlining a $75 million asset liquidation plan, and the terrifying moment Sarah had caught him photographing confidential legal documents. I explained his flawless demeanor and the impossible lack of a digital footprint prior to 10 years ago. It required a kind of absolute resilience that only comes from deep adversity. David listened in total silence, feeding the parameters into the Bureau's secure databases. Julian Thorne, he muttered, a perfectly constructed alias designed to withstand a standard corporate check. Let's look for the anomalies, cross-referencing facial recognition with known financial predators. The silence of the room was a testament to the severity of the upcoming battle. The search took time. We drank terrible coffee and waited as the algorithms combed through decades of records. Finally, the computer chimed, a positive match. The weight of the situation hung heavily in the cool autumn air. David leaned closer to the monitor, the color draining from his face. He turned the monitor toward me. It was a truth that could not be easily ignored. The photograph was undeniable. It was a slightly younger version of the man who had sat at my dinner table. But the name was not Julian Thorne. Elias Montgomery, David said in a grim whisper. Born in Nevada, no active warrants. But look at the history, Thomas. He was a person of interest in 2 massive fraud investigations that the Bureau could never definitively close. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. Walk me through it. 7 years ago, Portland. David began. The target was a prominent family in the timber industry. The daughter meets a charming financial consultant named Richard Sterling. He proposes marriage and convinces the father to consolidate the family trust. Within 30 days of being added as a co-trustee, $12 million vanishes into offshore accounts. Sterling disappears without a trace. And the second one, I asked calmly. 3 years ago, Scottsdale, David continued. Real estate developers. Meets the daughter at a charity event, gains absolute trust. The alias was Marcus Chen. He pushed for a co-trustee modification weeks before the wedding. $22 million evaporated overnight. The daughter suffered a complete psychological breakdown. This man was an apex predator. He targeted wealthy families, weaponized their trust, and drained their lifeblood before vanishing. And now he had set his sights on my daughter. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He had targeted the family of a federal prosecutor. The problem, Thomas, David said softly, is that we can't touch him for Oregon or Arizona. The paper trails were destroyed. The primary witnesses compromised. If we grab him now, he'll lawyer up and vanish again. I know, I said. I don't want to arrest him for the past. I want to build a cage so perfectly constructed that when the trap springs, he won't even realize he's been caught. David looked at me. What are you proposing? He wants the $75 million from my estate, I said. He wants to be a co-trustee so he can execute a wire transfer before the wedding. So, we give him what he wants, but we make absolutely certain that the moment he turns the lock, he commits undeniable federal wire fraud. I drove straight back to the Shenandoah Ridge estate to prepare for the most difficult conversation of my life. When I arrived, Sarah was on the back porch, staring out at the darkening pasture. I sat down next to her and placed the envelope David had given me on the table. Sarah, I said, my voice trembling slightly, I need you to listen to me. I need you to be the strongest person you have ever been. What I am about to show you is going to break your heart. But we are going to put it back together, and then we are going to destroy the man who did this. She reached out, her hand shaking violently, and opened the file. The covert investigation had ended. The war had officially begun, the morning after I revealed the horrific truth about Julian Thorne. Or rather, Elias Montgomery. A heavy, suffocating silence settled over the Shenandoah Ridge estate. Sarah had spent the night in her childhood bedroom. When she finally emerged, her face was pale, but the fragile woman from the night before was gone. In her place was a woman of forged steel. She was a pediatric surgeon. She knew how to compartmentalize trauma to save a life. Now she was compartmentalizing her own broken heart to save our family. It was a truth that could not be easily ignored. We sat in my study, the heavy mahogany doors locked. Across the desk sat William Hayes, my estate attorney, and one of my oldest, most trusted friends. William possessed the meticulous nature of a watchmaker and the legal ruthlessness of a great white shark. The sheer magnitude of the deception was difficult to fully process. "This is insane, Thomas," William said, reviewing the FBI file. "The man is a sociopath. You need a restraining order and have him removed from the property. You cannot willingly engage with a predator of this magnitude." Every passing moment seemed to stretch out into an eternity of waiting. "A restraining order just sends him scurrying back into the shadows," I countered. "He changes his name and finds another wealthy family to destroy. They don't stop until they are physically locked in a federal penitentiary. We have the unique opportunity to end his career permanently. We need him to commit a fresh, undeniable felony on American soil with the FBI watching." The quiet hum of the countryside offered a stark contrast to the storm brewing within. William sighed. "All right. How do we bait a man who has successfully evaded the FBI for a decade?" Time felt entirely suspended in these fleeting, quiet moments. "We use his own greed against him," I said. "He wants to be added as a co-trustee so he can authorize a massive wire transfer to his offshore accounts right before the wedding. We are going to give him the documents he needs, but we are going to utilize the doctrine of void ab initio." There was no turning back from the path that had now been chosen. William's eyes narrowed. "Void from the beginning. You want to create a decoy trust. The stakes had never been higher in the history of our entire family." "Exactly," I said. "We create the Shenandoah Ridge Secondary Holdings Trust. We fund it with a legitimate, traceable sum, $500,000, just enough to trigger the bank's verification algorithms. But the trust charter itself will be fundamentally, intentionally flawed. It required a kind of absolute resilience that only comes from deep adversity." I looked at Sarah. "Sarah, void ab initio means that a contract was never legally valid to begin with. We will ensure the trust documents contain fatal jurisdictional contradictions, invalid notary stamps, and an improperly witnessed signatory page. To a layman or a greedy financial consultant, it will look perfectly drafted. But legally, it doesn't exist. So when he signs as co-trustee," Sarah started. "When he signs it, he is signing a meaningless piece of paper," William finished. "But the moment he attempts to use that forged document to authorize a wire transfer, he commits federal wire fraud, bank fraud, and identity theft. The bank's automated security will flag the transfer, freeze the decoy funds, and notify the FBI. It's a perfect, closed loop," I concluded. "He thinks he's stealing $75 million. In reality, he's transmitting a digital confession directly to the Department of Justice." William tapped his pen. "The documents have to look absolutely flawless on the surface. If he spots the trap, he'll vanish." "Then we make them flawless," I said. "We use authentic watermarks and my actual signature. Make it your masterpiece. Hide the fatal flaws so deeply that even a Supreme Court clerk would need a week to find them." William nodded. "I can have it drafted and funded by Thursday. But Thomas, the hardest part isn't the legal paperwork. It's the execution." He turned to my daughter. "Sarah, you have to look this man in the eyes, smile, and play the role of the clueless fiancé. If he senses even a fraction of hesitation, the entire operation collapses. We were asking her to embrace a monster and perform under unimaginable psychological pressure." Sarah did not flinch, her jaw set with an iron resolve. "Julian Thorne is coming back this weekend to finalize the wedding venue details," Sarah said, her voice cool and clinical. "I will tell him that you and I had a long conversation. I will tell him that you are bringing him on as a co-trustee to manage the $75 million. I will be the perfect, loving partner. He won't suspect a thing." "Are you absolutely certain you can do this, sweetie?" I asked softly. "He manipulated my feelings. He planned to destroy our family," Sarah said, her eyes flashing with a beautiful anger. "Julian Thorne is a cancer, and I am going to help you cut him out of our lives." Over the next 3 days, the Shenandoah Ridge estate transformed into a covert command center. William drafted the brilliantly flawed documents. David Miller coordinated with the Federal Cybercrimes Unit, quietly placing digital tripwires on the decoy account. And Sarah prepared for the performance of a lifetime. She practiced her smiles in the mirror and modulated her tone. By Friday evening, the trap was set. The documents were printed on heavy bond paper and placed neatly in a leather folio. The decoy account was active, humming quietly in the digital ether. When Julian's Range Rover crunched up the graveled driveway on Saturday morning, I watched him step out into the Virginia sunshine. He looked perfectly relaxed, his handsome face fixed in that familiar, charming smile. He believed he was weeks away from the greatest heist of his career. He didn't realize he was walking directly into a federal cage. The game was no longer his to play. Setting a trap for a predator requires more than just bait. It requires an intimate understanding of the predator's hunger. Julian Thorne, or whatever his real name was, hungered for control, for the effortless acquisition of immense wealth without the vulgarity of brute force. He wanted the $75 million, but he wanted it cleanly, legally shielded by a meticulously constructed facade of familial trust. To catch him, we had to give him exactly what he wanted. We had to build him a golden cage and leave the door wide open, waiting for him to step inside and lock it himself. The morning after my clandestine meeting with Special Agent Miller and my longtime estate attorney, David Caldwell, I sat in my study with the heavy mahogany doors closed and locked. David, a man who had drafted the original Shenandoah Ridge Trust decades ago, sat across from me, looking distinctly uncomfortable. David was a brilliant legal mind, but his expertise lay in asset protection and tax mitigation, not in baiting federal wire fraud traps. "Thomas, I want to be absolutely clear about the immense risk we are taking here," David said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses for the third time in 10 minutes. He stared at the thick stack of documents resting between us on the leather-topped desk. "What you are asking me to draft is, on its face, a catastrophic surrender of your family's legacy. If these documents are executed and recorded, this man will have unfettered, unilateral authority to liquidate the entire $75 million portfolio and wire the proceeds to an offshore entity. Only if the documents are legally valid, David," I replied, leaning forward and resting my forearms on the desk, "which they won't be." David sighed, running a hand over his thinning gray hair. "The doctrine of void ab initio. Yes, I understand the legal theory. We are essentially creating a phantom trust, a mirror image of the actual Shenandoah Ridge Trust, but fundamentally flawed at its inception. We will use a defunct corporate entity as the primary signatory, an entity that was officially dissolved by the state of Delaware 3 weeks ago. Legally speaking, the entity cannot enter into a contract. Therefore, any document assigning co-trustee rights to Julian Thorne is null and void from the very moment he signs it." "Exactly," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "It's a ghost ship. It looks real, it feels real, but it has no legal substance." "But Thomas, the danger lies in the execution," David warned, tapping a manicured finger against the paperwork. "If Julian attempts to execute a wire transfer using these invalid documents, the receiving bank will initially process it based on the apparent authority of the paperwork. The fraud will be committed, yes, but the money will still leave the account. We are relying entirely on the FBI and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network to freeze the transfer mid-flight. If they are even a fraction of a second too late, the funds will disappear into a labyrinth of international shell companies, and it could take years to claw them back. If ever, Miller is coordinating directly with Finson and the compliance officers at the receiving institutions," I assured him, though I felt a cold knot of tension tightening in my gut. "The wire won't clear. The moment Julian initiates the transfer from his laptop, he crosses the threshold of federal wire fraud. He will be attempting to move funds based on fraudulent authority across state and international lines. That is a minimum of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. It is a clean, undeniable, airtight federal offense." David looked at me for a long time, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. He had known Catherine. He had stood beside me at her funeral. He understood exactly what was at stake. "You are playing a terrifying game of chicken with your daughter's entire future, Thomas." "I am securing her future," I corrected him gently. Julian is already inside the gates. If we try to throw him out now without proof, he will vanish, only to re-emerge later under a new name to destroy another family. Or worse, he will convince Sarah that I am a paranoid, controlling old man trying to ruin her happiness, and he will take her with him. I will not allow that to happen. We have to let him believe he has won. We have to let him put his hands on the money. David nodded slowly, finally accepting the grim necessity of our plan. He spent the next 4 hours meticulously drafting the trap. We created a breathtakingly complex series of amendments to the trust, wrapped in dense, impenetrable legalese designed to make Julian feel secure. The documents granted Julian Thorne full co-trustee status with the specific explicit authority to manage, restructure, and liquidate assets for the long-term prosperity of the Vance family. It was a masterpiece of legal deception. To a wealth manager, it looked like the ultimate blank check, but buried deep in the foundational definitions of the trust was the fatal flaw: the dissolved Delaware Corporation. It was a poison pill that rendered every subsequent clause utterly meaningless. When the documents were finally finished, they looked exactly like the kind of ironclad, unassailable legal instruments a cautious old-school patriarch would demand. They were printed on heavy watermark paper and bound in dark blue leather folders. They looked like power. They looked like $75 million. That opportunity arrived on a crisp Thursday afternoon, exactly 10 days before the scheduled wedding. Julian had driven down to the estate to assist with some of the final logistical planning for the reception, which was being held on the sweeping back lawns of Shenandoah Ridge. I had deliberately left the blue leather folders on my desk, positioned perfectly under the soft glow of the brass reading lamp. I invited Julian into the study for a glass of bourbon, a ritual we had established over the past few months. I poured 2 fingers of the expensive Blantons he had brought on his first visit, handing him the heavy crystal glass. "Julian, I want to thank you," I said, adopting a tone of weariness and quiet gratitude. I walked around the desk, ensuring my body language conveyed surrender. "The stress of this wedding, the estate, it's been weighing on me heavily. I'm not as young as I used to be, and Catherine's absence is felt more acutely now than ever." Julian's expression instantly shifted into a mask of profound empathy. He took a slow sip of his bourbon. "I can only imagine, Thomas. You've carried this family and this estate on your shoulders for a long time. It's entirely natural to feel the burden." "Sarah is my entire world," I continued, looking down at the desk, letting my gaze linger briefly on the blue folders. "Her happiness, her security, that is all that matters to me now. I've spent my life building this, protecting it, but I need to know it will be managed properly when I am no longer capable." Julian's eyes tracked my gaze. I saw the imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the sudden, sharp focus of a predator sensing weakness. He stepped closer to the desk, his voice dropping to a reassuring, confidential register. "Thomas, you know I will do everything in my power to protect Sarah and the legacy you've built here. My expertise is in ensuring that wealth is not just preserved, but optimized for future generations. If there is ever anything I can do to help ease this burden for you, you only need to ask." I looked up at him, letting a look of immense relief wash over my face. I reached out and tapped the blue folders. "I had David Caldwell draft these up yesterday," I said quietly. "It's a co-trustee amendment. It would grant you equal authority over the estate's financial portfolio, allowing you to restructure the assets as you see fit." Julian stared at the folders. For a fraction of a second, mask slipped, and I saw the raw, unfiltered greed burning in his eyes. It was a terrifying, hollow darkness. Then, just as quickly, the charming, humble facade slammed back into place. "Thomas, I am honored," Julian said, his voice thick with perfectly manufactured emotion. "This is an extraordinary display of trust. I don't know what to say. I will review these tonight." He took the folder, his fingers gripping the leather tightly. He had taken the bait. The trap was set. Now we just had to wait for the jaws to snap shut. The psychological pressure of a covert operation does not come from the threat of sudden violence. It comes from the excruciating, unrelenting necessity of maintaining a lie. Every word, every gesture, every microscopic reaction must be perfectly calibrated to match a fabricated reality. For a trained federal agent or a seasoned prosecutor, this is difficult but manageable. For Sarah, A pediatric surgeon who had spent her entire life valuing absolute honesty and precision, it was an emotional crucible that threatened to break her apart from the inside out. As the wedding drew closer, the tension within the walls of Shenandoah Ridge Estate grew nearly palpable. It hung in the air like the heavy, oppressive humidity that precedes a violent summer thunderstorm. Julian Thorne had taken the bait, the fraudulent co-trustee documents I had provided him, but taking the bait was only the first step. He now believed he was mere days away from securing absolute legal control over $75 million. The proximity to his ultimate goal was acting like a powerful stimulant, accelerating his timeline and amplifying his predatory instincts. He began to push, subtly at first, and then with increasing forceful urgency. It started on a Tuesday evening, just 8 days before the wedding. The three of us were sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the timberline. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the cold, calculated manipulation unfolding at the table. Julian had spent the last hour subtly dominating the conversation, steering it away from wedding logistics and toward global financial instability. "The market indicators I'm seeing out of Asia are deeply troubling," Julian said, leaning forward and resting his elbows on the wrought iron table. His voice was laced with a manufactured, grave concern. "There's a massive liquidity crunch coming, Thomas. The tech sector is already showing signs of a significant contraction, and the ripple effects on traditional equity portfolios like the Shenandoah Trust could be catastrophic." I took a slow sip of my iced tea, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "We've weathered market corrections before, Julian. The portfolio is heavily diversified. Diversification won't protect against a systemic liquidity freeze." Julian countered smoothly, his eyes locking onto mine with intense, persuasive focus. "The restructuring strategy we discussed, the reallocation of the primary liquid assets into the secure, offshore holding structures, needs to be executed before the end of the fiscal quarter. Ideally, within the next 48 hours, before the Asian markets fully react to the upcoming Federal Reserve announcements." He was establishing a false sense of urgency, a classic con artist tactic designed to force his victim into making rapid, consequential decisions without time for independent verification. He needed those documents signed, and he needed the wire transfer initiated before the wedding, likely planning to vanish during the chaotic distraction of the ceremony itself. 48 hours is an incredibly aggressive timeline, Julian," I noted, allowing a trace of paternal hesitation to enter my voice. "The co-trustee documents haven't even been finalized by the notary. I can have my private notary fly in from New York tomorrow morning." Julian offered instantly, anticipating my objection. "Thomas, I am trying to protect your family's legacy. If we wait until after the wedding, the market window will close, and we could see a 20% devaluation of the liquid assets. I cannot, in good conscience, allow that to happen on my watch." I looked at Sarah. This was the moment of maximum danger. We had rehearsed this, but rehearsing a lies in a safe room is vastly different from performing it under the piercing gaze of a sociopath who believes he is about to steal your life's work. Sarah was holding a glass of white wine, her knuckles white from the force of her grip. She looked at Julian, her eyes wide, projecting the perfect image of a loving, slightly overwhelmed, and completely trusting fiancé. "Julian is the expert, Dad," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound entirely genuine. "If he says the money is in danger, we have to listen to him. I don't pretend to understand global markets, but I understand Julian. He wouldn't push this hard unless it was absolutely necessary for our future." It was a flawless performance. The vulnerability in her voice, the desperate trust in her eyes, it was so profoundly convincing that for a terrifying fraction of a second, even I felt a stab of doubt. Julian looked at her, his expression softening into a mask of deep protective affection. He reached out and gently stroked her cheek. "Thank you, sweetheart," he murmured softly. "I promise you, I have everything under control." The sheer, staggering hypocrisy of the gesture made my blood run cold. He was looking into the eyes of the woman he was actively trying to destroy, offering her comfort while meticulously calculating the fastest route to her financial ruin. "All right," I said, exhaling a long, heavy breath, playing the part of the exhausted patriarch finally yielding to the inevitable. Have your notary come tomorrow. We'll sign the documents. But Julian, I expect you to handle the transfer personally. I don't want this delegated. Of course, Thomas. Julian smiled, a thin, triumphant curve of his lips. I wouldn't trust this to anyone else. Later that night, long after Julian had retired to the guest house, I found Sarah standing in the dark kitchen. She was leaning against the marble counter, staring out the window at the empty driveway. The moonlight caught the faint glimmer of tears on her face. I walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. She didn't turn around, but she leaned into my touch, her body shaking silently. I feel sick, Dad, she whispered, her voice cracking. Every time he touches me, every time he calls me sweetheart, I feel like I have poison in my veins. I am looking at a man who doesn't actually exist. The Julian I loved, the Julian I thought I was going to marry, he's just a mask, a strategy. I know, sweetie. I know, I said softly, pulling her into an embrace. It is a profound violation. It is a psychological violence that leaves scars no one else can see. But you are doing incredibly well. You are stronger than he is, and he doesn't even realize it. He asked me about our honeymoon today, she continued, her voice muffled against my chest. He talked about walking on the beach in Santorini, about the life we were going to build together. And he looked so sincere, Dad. How does a human being do that? How do you look someone in the eyes and promise them forever while you are actively destroying them? Because he is empty, I told her, drawing on 3 decades of prosecuting the worst of humanity. People like Julian Thorne do not experience empathy or love the way we do. They experience leverage. They experience acquisition. He doesn't see you as a partner, Sarah. He sees you as a key to a vault. That emptiness makes him dangerous, but it also makes him blind. He cannot comprehend that you might be capable of deceiving him because he believes genuine emotion is a weakness that guarantees submission. Sarah pulled back slightly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. A sudden, fierce resolve hardened her features, replacing the despair with a cold, focused determination. He thinks I'm weak, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He thinks you are predictable, I corrected. Tomorrow, we sign the documents. The moment he initiates that wire transfer, the FBI intercepts it, and the trap closes. The illusion ends tomorrow. She took a deep breath, her posture straightening. The pediatric surgeon returning to the surface, precise, controlled, and ready to cut out the infection. Let him bring his notary. I want to watch his face when the vault finally locks him inside. The 4 weeks leading up to the wedding were a masterclass in psychological endurance. For Sarah, the pressure was an invisible vice tightening around her ribs every time Julian entered the room. She was a pediatric surgeon. Her entire career was built on maintaining absolute emotional control while holding tiny, fragile lives in her hands. She was accustomed to high-stakes environments where a single millimeter of error could result in catastrophe. But operating on a child's heart, she later told me, was a straightforward kind of terror compared to the sickening performance she had to maintain with Julian Thorne. Every morning, she woke up beside a man who was actively plotting to destroy our family, steal $75 million, and discard her the moment the funds cleared his offshore accounts. Every morning, she had to turn to him, smile softly, and kiss the cheek of a predator. She played the role of the perfect, clueless fiancé with a terrifying brilliance. She discussed floral arrangements, finalized the catering menu, and debated the merits of a string quartet versus a jazz band for the reception. She laughed at his carefully calibrated jokes and leaned into his touch, suppressing the violent shudder of revulsion that clawed at her throat. I feel like I'm losing my mind, Dad, she confessed one evening, her voice a fragile whisper. We were standing in the darkest corner of the estate's sprawling greenhouse, surrounded by blooming orchids and the heavy, damp smell of fertilized soil. Julian was inside the main house, supposedly taking a crucial conference call with a client in London. We knew, thanks to the wiretap the FBI had discreetly installed on his primary device, that he was actually speaking to a document forger in Miami, finalizing the fake corporate entity he planned to use to funnel the trust funds. You are doing perfectly, Sarah, I said, gripping her shoulders. You just need to hold on a little longer. The trap is completely set. We just need him to step into it. He touched my neck today while I was making coffee, she said, her eyes wide and haunted in the dim light. He was so gentle. If I didn't know the truth, if I hadn't seen that spreadsheet, I would still think he was the greatest thing that ever happened to me. That is the most terrifying part, Dad. The absolute perfection of the illusion. I pulled her into a tight embrace, feeling the fine tremors racking her frame. I know, sweetheart, I know, but the illusion is going to shatter very soon. Julian, meanwhile, was increasing his subtle, relentless pressure to expedite the legal timeline. He was careful, of course. He never demanded anything outright. His manipulations were always couched in the language of protection, efficiency, and profound care for our family's legacy. He recognized that I, the cautious, retired federal prosecutor, was the final obstacle. He believed he had spent the last several months flawlessly dismantling my defenses, earning my trust through a meticulously executed charm offensive. 2 days after my conversation with Sarah in the greenhouse, Julian cornered me in my study. I was sitting at the heavy mahogany desk, reviewing the estate's quarterly tax projections. It was a mundane task that provided the perfect cover for my real work. He knocked twice, respectfully, before stepping into the room with 2 crystal glasses and a fresh bottle of the expensive bourbon he favored. "Am I interrupting, Thomas?" he asked, his voice smooth and deferential. He always called me Thomas now, a subtle linguistic shift designed to assert a familial equality. "Not at all, Julian. Just fighting with the tax code," I replied, leaning back and gesturing to the leather armchair opposite the desk. "Have a seat." He poured the bourbon with practiced grace, handing me a glass before settling into the chair. He took a slow sip, letting a comfortable, companionable silence stretch between us for a moment. It was a classic interrogation tactic. Use silence to make the other person fill the void. I let him wait. I had spent 30 years outwaiting federal suspects in brightly lit rooms. A comfortable study with good bourbon was child's play. Finally, Julian leaned forward, his expression shifting into a mask of earnest concern. "Thomas, I have been reviewing the logistics for next week. With the wedding fast approaching and the inevitable chaos that follows. The honeymoon in Amalfi, the restructuring of Sarah's schedule at the hospital. I want to ensure nothing falls through the cracks regarding the estate." "I appreciate your diligence, Julian," I said smoothly, taking a deliberate sip of my drink. "What specifically is on your mind?" "The co-trustee documentation," he said, holding my gaze with perfect sincerity. "I know we discussed finalizing it after the wedding, once everything settles down. But given the current market volatility and some of the tax implications of the upcoming quarter, I strongly believe it would be in the trust's best interest to execute the transfer of administrative power beforehand. It would allow me to immediately implement the asset protection strategies we discussed, without a 30-day waiting period." There it was, the push. He was greedy, and his timeline was tightening. He wanted the legal authority secured before the wedding, likely to initiate the transfers while everyone was distracted by the celebration. I feigned a slight hesitation, letting a flicker of paternal caution cross my face. "You think it is necessary to rush it, Julian? The trust has operated under the current structure for decades. Not rushed, Thomas. Optimized," he countered seamlessly, leaning closer, his voice dropping into a reassuring confidential register. "I completely understand your protective instinct. You built this legacy. But my primary goal, my only goal, is to ensure that Sarah's future is absolutely bulletproof. If we execute the co-trustee documents this Thursday, I can lock in the current interest rates on the municipal bonds and shield the liquid assets from the impending capital gains adjustments. It is simply a matter of proactive wealth preservation." He was incredibly convincing. Every word was perfectly calibrated to appeal to a father's desire for security and a retired lawyer's appreciation for financial strategy. If I hadn't already worked with the FBI and my estate attorney to draft a meticulously flawed set of documents designed specifically to trigger the legal doctrine of void ab initio the moment he signed them, I might have believed him. "You make a compelling argument, Julian," I said slowly, allowing my resistance to visibly melt away. "You have proven your competence over these last few months. If you believe Thursday is the optimal window to execute the documents, I will have my attorney finalize the paperwork. We can sign them here in the study." A microscopic flash of triumph flared deep in his eyes, vanishing almost instantly behind a humble smile. I appreciate your trust, Thomas. I promise you, I will guard this family's assets as if they were my own. I know you will, I thought, suppressing a cold, grim smile. That is exactly what I am counting on. I will call my attorney in the morning, I said, raising my glass. To the future, Julian. To the future, he echoed, the crystal clinking softly in the quiet room. When he left the study, I immediately opened the encrypted laptop secured in my desk drawer. I sent a single, prearranged code word to Special Agent Miller at the FBI field office. The message was simple. The bait is taken. The signing is Thursday. The tension, which had been building for months, finally crystallized into a singular, razor-sharp point. We were no longer waiting. The trap was armed, and the predator was walking willingly toward the jaws. The arrival of wedding week transformed the Shenandoah Ridge estate into a whirlwind of organized chaos, a beautiful, sprawling distraction that served our purposes perfectly. Vendors arrived in unmarked white vans, unloading towering floral arrangements of white hydrangeas and pale pink roses. The massive outdoor tent was erected on the south lawn, its white canvas billowing slightly in the early summer breeze. Caterers rushed back and forth, string quartets practiced in the parlor, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, expensive perfumes, and blooming jasmine. To any outside observer, it was the picture-perfect culmination of a whirlwind romance. A wealthy, beautiful surgeon marrying a successful, handsome wealth manager on a sprawling Virginia estate. It was a fairy tale carefully curated for public consumption, but beneath the surface, a very different, much colder reality was unfolding. The estate was crawling with federal agents. They were not wearing windbreakers with bright yellow letters. They were dressed as caterers, as valets, as audiovisual technicians, adjusting the lighting in the reception tent. Special Agent Miller was currently masquerading as the head of security for the catering company, standing by the main gates with an earpiece, monitoring every vehicle that entered or exited the property. Julian was in his element. He moved through the chaos with effortless grace, charming the vendors, directing the logistics, and playing the role of the devoted, slightly overwhelmed groom to absolute perfection. He was supremely confident. He believed he had won. He believed that in less than 48 hours, he would be in possession of $75 million, and Sarah and I would be left financially ruined and emotionally destroyed. Thursday morning arrived, crisp and clear. This was the day we had agreed to sign the co-trustee documents. The moment of execution, at exactly 10 o'clock, Julian knocked on the door of my study. He was dressed impeccably, as always, in a tailored navy suit. He carried a leather folio under his arm. "Come in, Julian," I called out. He entered the room, his eyes quickly scanning the space. My estate attorney, Arthur Pendleton, was already seated at the small conference table in the corner, a stack of thick legal-sized documents arranged neatly before him. Arthur was an old friend, a brilliant legal mind who had spent weeks working with the FBI to draft these specific documents. "Julian, good morning," Arthur said, rising to shake his hand. "Everything is prepared as you and Thomas discussed." "Excellent." "Thank you, Arthur," Julian replied smoothly, taking a seat at the table. He exuded a calm, professional confidence, betraying absolutely none of the greed that I knew was burning inside him. "Before we begin," I said, taking my seat across from him, "I want to reiterate how much this means to me, Julian. Handing over control of this trust is not something I take lightly. It represents a lifetime of work. But seeing how you care for Sarah, and witnessing your financial acumen over these past months, I am confident this is the right decision. It was a performance worthy of an Academy Award." I injected just the right amount of paternal vulnerability into my voice. Julian ate it up. "Thomas, I am honored," Julian said, placing a hand over his heart. "I will not let you down." Arthur cleared his throat and began pushing the documents across the table. "These are the co-trustee designation forms, Julian. They grant you full administrative authority over the Vance Family Trust, effective immediately upon signing. This includes authorization to liquidate assets, initiate wire transfers, and restructure the portfolio as you see fit." Julian reviewed the documents with a practiced, critical eye. He checked the account numbers, the legal jargon, and the signature lines. He was thorough, looking for any sign of a trap. But he found nothing, because the flaw in these documents was invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for. The documents were void ab initio. They contained a deliberate, fatal flaw in the legal framing. A subtle contradiction in the jurisdiction clauses and the beneficiary designations that rendered the entire contract legally null and void from the moment of inception. To a standard wealth manager, it looked like a complex but standard trust document. To a federal prosecutor, it was a beautifully crafted snare. Because the documents were void, any action Julian took, based on the authority they supposedly granted him, would instantly become an unauthorized, fraudulent act. The moment he attempted to transfer those funds, he would cross the threshold into federal wire fraud. "Everything looks perfectly in order," Julian said, reaching into his pocket and retrieving an expensive fountain pen. He uncapped it with a soft click. He signed his name on the first page. Then the second, then the third. With every stroke of his pen, he was writing his own conviction. "There we go," Julian said, capping his pen and sliding the documents back to Arthur. He smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile. The smile of a man who believes he has just stolen an empire. "Excellent," Arthur said, gathering the papers. "I will file these with the county clerk first thing in the morning." "Actually, Arthur," Julian said casually, "if it's not too much trouble, I'd like a digitized copy of those immediately. I want to execute a few minor portfolio adjustments this afternoon, just to lock in some favorable rates before the wedding weekend completely consumes us." There it was. He couldn't even wait 24 hours. "Of course," Arthur replied, betraying no emotion. "I will scan them and email you a secure link within the hour." Julian stood up, shaking my hand one final time. "Thank you, Thomas. Truly." "My pleasure, Julian," I said. An hour later, Julian was in the guest house, alone. We knew this because the FBI cameras, discreetly installed in the smoke detectors, showed him sitting at a laptop. The wiretap on his phone picked up his call to his offshore bank in the Cayman Islands. In my study, I sat with Special Agent Miller, staring at a laptop screen that displayed a live mirror of Julian's keystrokes. We watched, breathless, as Julian accessed the Vance family trust portal using the credentials the newly signed and legally void documents provided. We watched as he bypassed the municipal bonds and the long-term investments, heading straight for the liquid cash accounts, $75 million. He entered the routing number for a shell corporation based in Cyprus. He entered his authorization code. The screen paused on a final confirmation prompt. "Are you sure you want to transfer 75,000? Zero?" Julian's cursor hovered over the confirm button. The silence in my study was absolute. The tension was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. He clicked. The screen flashed a green confirmation message. "Transfer initiated." Pending verification, Agent Miller exhaled a long, sharp breath and tapped his earpiece. "Transfer initiated," he said calmly into the microphone. "We have the wire fraud. The threshold is met. Move in." The trap had sprung, the jaws had snapped shut. Julian Thorne's carefully constructed world was about to violently, irreversibly collapse. The week of the wedding arrived with a frantic energy that contrasted with the stillness of our legal trap. Caterers buzzed around the main house. Florists constructed elaborate arches of white roses, and an army of staff transformed the property. To an outside observer, it was a joyous culmination of romance. To me, and to the federal agents positioned discreetly down the highway, it was the final act of a highly orchestrated sting operation. For months, we meticulously constructed this illusion. We fed Julian Thorne the bait he required, nurturing his arrogance until he was convinced of his invincibility. Now, the trap was set. The trigger was a stack of legal documents resting inside the heavy leather briefcase on my study desk. It was Wednesday morning, 3 days before the ceremony. Sarah was upstairs, ostensibly caught up in a whirlwind of dress fittings. In reality, she was pacing the floor, her nerves stretched to the breaking point. She had played the role of the adoring fiancée perfectly, masking her deep anxiety. But the strain of sleeping next to a predator had taken a brutal toll on her health and her peace of mind. I needed to execute the final maneuver and get Julian out of her life permanently, securing our family's safety once and for all. I found Julian in the sunroom, nursing a black coffee. He looked at ease, the picture of a man who had won the ultimate prize, his tailored linen suit draped flawlessly, radiating a quiet, triumphant confidence. "Julian," I said, keeping my voice warm and injecting the paternal affection he expected. "Do you have a moment?" "Of course, Thomas. The estate looks magnificent, it certainly does. Let's step into my study. There is one final piece of administrative housekeeping we need to address before the weekend." He followed me down the hallway, his footsteps echoing softly. I could sense the predatory sharpening of his focus, the quiet anticipation of a man about to win. He played the role of the respectful future son-in-law perfectly. I walked into the study, shut the door, and moved behind my desk. I opened the briefcase and withdrew the manila envelope containing the trust documents. I placed them on the leather blotter. "Julian, we have had many conversations about the future of this estate and the management of the family assets." I began, adopting the grave tone of a patriarch. "Sarah is a brilliant surgeon, but her passion is in the operating room, not in managing a complex portfolio of liquid assets." Julian nodded slowly. "She saves lives, Thomas. Her work is far too important to be weighed down by financial logistics." "Exactly. And as I step back into full retirement, I need to know those logistics are in capable hands." I tapped the envelope. "These are the revised documents for the Vance Family Trust. I have instructed my attorneys to formally add you as a co-trustee, granting you full signatory authority and administrative control over the liquid assets." Julian's eyes locked onto the envelope. The hunger in them was palpable, raw, and terrifying. It was a hunger that had driven him to ruin countless lives. He quickly masked it with a look of profound humility. "Thomas, I don't know what to say," he murmured. "This is a tremendous responsibility." "It is. But you have proven yourself, Julian. You are family now." I slid the documents across the desk along with my gold Mont Blanc pen. What Julian did not know was that he was looking at a masterpiece of legal deception. The documents he was about to sign were not tied to the actual Vance Family Trust. They were tied to the Decoy Trust, a meticulously fabricated entity created in cooperation with the FBI. The Decoy Trust contained exactly $75 million, heavily monitored and completely restricted. But the true genius of the trap lay in a fundamental principle of contract law. Void ab initio, Julian believed he was signing a legitimate modification to an existing trust. But because the Decoy Trust was constructed specifically as an instrument of a federal stings, and because Julian's intent was fraudulent, the documents were legally void from the moment they were created. They granted him absolutely nothing. However, the act of signing them with the intent to defraud, and subsequently attempting to move the funds across state lines, would constitute a definitive act of federal wire fraud. He picked up the pen. His hand betrayed a microscopic tremor of anticipation. He flipped to the signature pages, barely scanning the dense legal boilerplate. He had already photographed the early drafts, analyzed them, and confirmed they gave him the power he needed. He believed he was outsmarting a retired, grieving old man. He signed his name on the first line, Julian Thorne. He initialed the final addendum. With those strokes of ink, Julian Thorne had just bound himself to a federal indictment with a mandatory minimum sentence of 20 years. "There," he said, exhaling softly. He looked up, his expression radiant with triumph. "Done. I promise you, Thomas, I will manage this family's legacy with the utmost care." "I have absolutely no doubt about that, Julian," I said. "I know exactly what you are going to do." He left the study a few minutes later. I waited exactly 60 seconds before opening my laptop and logging into the secure monitoring portal the FBI had established. The trap required one final action. Signing the documents demonstrated intent, but the actual crime of wire fraud required the electronic transmission of funds. Julian needed to initiate the transfer. I watched the screen as the minutes ticked by. I pictured him finding a quiet corner, pulling out his encrypted phone, and accessing the offshore accounts he had prepared. His greed was too powerful. 10 minutes later, a red alert flashed across the dashboard. Transfer initiated amount, $75,000. Destination, Cayman Islands. I picked up my secure phone and dialed Special Agent Reynolds. He answered on the first ring. "We have movement," I said, my voice cold and steady. "He just initiated the wire." "Confirmed on our end, Thomas," Reynolds replied. "The transfer is caught in the federal holding pattern. We have him on 3 counts of wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, and forgery." The The warrant is signed. Good, I said, staring at the closed door of my study. Let him enjoy the rehearsal dinner tonight. Tomorrow, we tear his life apart. The rehearsal dinner was held Thursday evening on the stone patio overlooking the river. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant strokes of violet and gold, illuminating the faces of the 40 assembled guests. Crystal glasses clinked in toasts to the newly betrothed couple, laughter echoed, and a string quartet played softly. It was a scene of perfect elegance, meticulously constructed to disguise the impending storm. I sat at the head of the candlelit table, observing with the detached focus of a prosecutor preparing for closing arguments. Julian was in his element, charming my extended family and weaving flawless anecdotes about his non-existent childhood. He believed he had won, that the $75 million was already clearing the international banking protocols, securing his untraceable future in a tropical paradise where he could live in absolute luxury without ever looking over his shoulder. Sarah sat beside him, wearing a stunning emerald green dress that accentuated her pale face. She was holding herself together by a thread, waiting for the signal we had agreed upon. As the dessert course was cleared, Julian tapped his champagne flute with a silver spoon. The string quartet faded to silence. Sarah, from the moment I met you, my entire world shifted on its axis, Julian began, his voice projecting with theatrical resonance. You showed me what it truly means to build a future. He turned to me, raising his glass, and to Thomas. You welcomed me into your family and trusted me with the legacy you and Catherine built. I promised to spend my life honoring that trust. To the future. The guests echoed the toast, raising their glasses. I did not raise mine. I stood up slowly, my chair scraping harshly against the stone patio, instantly shattering the delicate atmosphere. Silence rippled down the table. That was a beautiful speech, Julian, I said, my voice carrying clearly in the quiet night air. It was moving, articulate, and completely fabricated. From the first syllable to the last, the guests froze. A few nervous chuckles died instantly. Sarah exhaled sharply. Her knuckles turning white, Julian's smile faltered, a microscopic twitch breaking through his polished facade. He assumed this was a strange display of patriarchal authority. Thomas, he said, injecting respectful confusion into his voice. I'm not sure I understand. I am sure you don't, I replied. Because for the past 14 months you have operated under the assumption that you are the smartest person in the room. You believed your aliases, your shell companies, and your offshore accounts made you invisible. Julian's posture shifted. The easy charm vanished, replaced by the rigid tension of a cornered animal. I think you've had too much to drink, Thomas, Julian said with a dangerous edge, reaching for Sarah's shoulder. Don't touch her, I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Sarah instantly stood up and stepped rapidly away from him, shattering the illusion of their relationship in front of 40 witnesses. Julian demanded, the polished veneer cracking. What is this? This is the end of the line, Julian, I said calmly. Or should I say Marcus or Arthur? Let's stick with Julian Thorne tonight, since that is the name you signed on the decoy trust documents this morning. The color drained from his face. The name Decoy Trust hit him like a physical blow as his master plan collapsed. You signed those documents believing they gave you authority over $75 million, I continued. And at 10:45 a.m. you used an encrypted device to initiate a wire transfer of those funds to the Cayman Islands, a routing number the FBI has monitored for weeks. You're lying, he hissed. The documents were verified. The transfer cleared. The documents were void ab initio, I corrected him, legally invalid from the moment of their creation. The act of signing them with fraudulent intent and the subsequent initiation of the transfer constitutes 3 counts of federal wire fraud. I checked my watch. The federal holding pattern intercepted your transfer exactly 4 seconds after you initiated it. Julian spun around, calculating an escape route. The elegant wealth manager was gone, replaced by a trapped predator. He looked toward the dark tree line. 3 unmarked SUVs accelerated up the gravel driveway, slamming to a halt at the patio. A dozen federal agents swarmed onto the stone terrace. FBI, nobody move! Special Agent Reynolds shouted. Pushing through the stunned guests, Julian panicked. He shoved past a waiter, sending crystal glasses crashing, and bolted toward the rolling lawn. Two agents tackled him hard into the manicured grass, driving his face into the dirt. "Julian Thorne, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, attempted grand larceny, and interstate flight to avoid prosecution." Reynolds barked, snapping handcuffs onto Julian's wrists. They hauled him to his feet. His tailored tuxedo was torn and smeared with mud. He looked at me, his eyes burning with venomous hatred. "You set me up from the beginning," he spat. "No, Julian," I said. "You set yourself up the moment you looked at my daughter and saw nothing but a payout. You walked into a house built by a prosecutor and thought you could lie your way to the vault." "Get this garbage off my property," I told Reynolds. They dragged Julian to the SUVs, shoving him into the back seat. The vehicles reversed down the driveway. Leaving the estate in a ringing silence, I turned back to the stone patio. My guests stood completely frozen, staring at me in absolute shock. I looked past them, past the broken glass and the chaos, to find Sarah standing alone. She was trembling violently, tears streaming silently down her pale cheeks. But her shoulders were straight and tall. The crushing, terrifying weight of the last 14 months was finally lifted from her completely. She was safe. The predator was truly gone. I walked over, wrapping my arms around her, and pulled her into a tight, fiercely protective embrace. She held on to me as if she were drowning and sobbed quietly into my shoulder. "It's completely over, sweetie," I whispered fiercely into her hair. "He's gone for good." I looked up at the vast, dark sky over the estate, feeling the cool night air settle over us. I thought about my late wife, Catherine, and the final critical promise she had asked me to make before she passed: trust, but verify. I had verified, and in doing so, I had protected the only thing that truly mattered. It has been exactly 6 months since the heavy steel doors of a federal holding facility closed permanently behind Julian Thorne, or Arthur Vance, or Marcus Chen, or whichever of the meticulously crafted, fraudulent identities he had chosen to wear on the day. The United States government finally caught up with him. In the end, the specific name didn't really matter. The man was a ghost who had spent his life trying to build a massive fortune on the shattered trust of grieving families, and he had finally chosen to haunt the wrong house. The criminal trial is still pending, but the prosecution's case against him is an impenetrable fortress. The decoy trust we carefully set up, the terrifying trap that ultimately caught him, had functioned flawlessly. When Julian confidently signed those co-trustee documents and eagerly initiated the $75 million wire transfer to his offshore accounts, he hadn't just committed a financial crime. He had documented it, notarized it, and handed it directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The legal doctrine of void ab initio had worked exactly as planned. The documents were forged, entirely invalid, from the moment his pen touched the expensive paper, making his attempt to execute them a definitive, irreversible act of federal wire fraud. He is currently facing 32 separate counts of wire fraud, aggravated forgery, and criminal identity theft. The mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines alone will ensure he spends the next 2 decades of his life in a maximum security federal prison. But the legal victory, as clean and absolute as it is, feels distinctly secondary to the quiet reality of our lives now. It is late October, and the sprawling Shenandoah Ridge estate is awash in the fiery colors of the Virginia autumn. The morning air is crisp, carrying the familiar scent of fallen oak leaves and distant wood smoke. I am sitting in my heavy wooden chair on the wraparound back porch, a steaming cup of black coffee warming my hands, watching the thick morning mist slowly burn off the green grazing fields. Henry Cobb is already out by the western fence line, his weathered farm truck parked at a sharp angle, exactly where it always is at this hour. Sarah is sitting next to me. She drove down from Boston late last night, entirely unannounced, simply because she wanted to see the sunrise over the distant timberline. The last 6 months have not been easy for her. The deep betrayal she experienced was not merely a broken heart. It was a fundamental, devastating shattering of her reality. Julian had not just lied to her. He had weaponized her deepest emotional vulnerabilities, perfectly mimicking the exact kind of love, support, and understanding she had been desperately craving ever since her mother passed away. Healing from that kind of severe psychological violation is a slow, agonizing process. It requires dismantling the harsh instinct to suspect everyone and slowly, painfully learning how to safely believe in the inherent goodness of people once again. But she is surviving. More than that, she is truly beginning to thrive again. She bravely took a full month off from the demanding hospital, intentionally stepping away from the relentless pressure of pediatric surgery to just breathe. We spent those 4 quiet weeks right here, isolated on the estate. We deliberately didn't talk about Julian. We didn't talk about the FBI, the grand jury subpoenas, or the forged trust documents. We fixed broken wooden fences. We rode the quarter horses along the river. We sat together on this very porch in comfortable silence and watched the black cattle move slowly through the pasture. We steadily rebuilt the fractured foundation of our family, piece by piece, relying entirely on the quiet, enduring strength that Catherine had left us. "It is absolutely beautiful this morning," Sarah says quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. Her voice is clear, devoid of the fragile, terrified tension that had gripped her so tightly during the spring. "It certainly is," I agree, taking a slow, appreciative sip of my dark coffee. "Your mother always loved October the best. She used to say it was the Earth's gentle way of reminding us that letting things go can be a remarkably beautiful process." Sarah smiles, a genuine soft expression that finally reaches all the way to her eyes. She was absolutely right. She leans back in her wooden rocking chair, pulling her thick woolen cardigan tighter around her slender shoulders against the autumn chill. "I got a formal letter from the federal prosecutor's office yesterday afternoon. They politely asked if I wanted to formally submit a victim impact statement for the upcoming sentencing hearings." I turned to look directly at her. "And what did you ultimately decide?" "I decided that I have absolutely nothing left to say to him," she replies, her tone carrying a quiet, unshakable resolve. "He took enough of my precious time, Dad. He took enough of my emotional energy. I refuse to give him a single additional word. Let the federal statutes do all the talking." Pride, fierce and sudden, swells heavily in my chest. "That is an exceptionally good answer, Sarah." "Well, I did learn from the absolute best," she says, affectionately nudging my shoulder with hers. We sit in peaceful silence for a while longer, quietly watching the bright morning sun crest the distant horizon, casting long golden shadows across the dew-soaked pasture grass. The estate feels profoundly peaceful, deeply grounded, and entirely secure. I think deeply about the solemn promise I made to Catherine in that sterile hospital room in Baltimore. I had promised to retire, to finally step away from the relentless, consuming darkness of the Justice Department and to live like a normal human being. I had kept that promise, but the second promise, the cryptic warning that had relentlessly haunted me, the specific advice that had ultimately saved us from total ruin, was the one that truly mattered the most. Trust, but verify, Thomas. Especially with Sarah. I had spent my entire 30-year professional career believing that trust was a dangerous liability, a fatal weakness that ruthless criminals eagerly exploited to destroy the innocent. I had viewed the entire world through the cynical, heavily guarded lens of a federal prosecutor, constantly expecting the absolute worst in people, always waiting for the charming mask to inevitably slip. But Catherine had always known something far more profound. She had inherently known that trust is not a weakness at all. It is the very foundation of absolutely everything worth having in this life. But she also deeply understood that true protection requires constant vigilance. Love is not blind. Real love is keeping your eyes wide open, recognizing the genuine dangers that lurk in the shadows, and standing fiercely between those dangers and the fragile people you hold most dear. I look at my incredible daughter, a brilliant, resilient woman who miraculously fixes broken hearts for a living, and I know with absolute certainty that her own heart, though severely bruised, is actively healing. It is significantly stronger now, effectively fortified by the harsh reality of the world, but thankfully not hardened by it. She will undoubtedly love again. She will slowly trust again. But she will do so with the hard-earned wisdom of a powerful woman who knows exactly what she is inherently worth, and exactly what it takes to fiercely protect it, and I will always be right here, standing my ground on the Shenandoah Ridge estate, watching the dense timberline, keeping the sacred promises I made to the woman I loved. The world is unfortunately full of Julian Thorns, ruthless, empty men who wear perfect suits, smile convincingly with their eyes, and arrive looking exactly like the one thing you most desperately want to believe in. They are infinitely patient, they are incredibly cunning, and they are always ruthlessly searching for the next emotional vulnerability to exploit. But they all have one fatal flaw. They arrogantly underestimate the quiet, unyielding strength of a united family that absolutely refuses to be broken. They severely underestimate the protective power of a seasoned father who has spent 3 long decades completely dismantling liars. And they entirely underestimate the profound, enduring truth that some human bonds, the specific ones forged in deep love, severely tested in fire and fiercely protected, can never, ever be stolen. Trust is undeniably a beautiful thing. It is the brilliant light that guides us safely through the darkest, coldest moments of our complicated lives. But as I sit here and watch the bright morning sun completely illuminate the rolling Virginia hills, I know with absolute certainty that Catherine's final lesson will remain deeply ingrained within me until my very last breath. Trust, but verify. Always, always verify.